Welcome, wrestling fans, to the Pro Wrestle Machine. Whether you're tuning in from the Great American Bash or halfway around the world, we've got a jam-packed episode for you. Get ready to dive into wrestling's rich history, packed with insights, opinions, and a few surprises. And remember, you can skip to your favorite moments with our chapter markers. Let's jump right into it. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. December 5, 1999 Observer Newsletter. WWF losing advertisers, Steve Austin gets good news on his neck. By Dave Meltzer. After 2 years of the WWF's new direction turning it into prime advertising for companies aiming products at in particular teenage and young adult males, suddenly, this week advertisers were dropping like flies. Besides Coca-Cola dropping all WWF sponsorship 3 weeks ago, which spawned a lot of mainstream media coverage this week, and the crowning of Parent Television Council Chairman L. Brent Bozell in the former Phil Mushnick role as the enemy number one of the WWF and all wrestling fans who simplify their morality into what is good or bad for the moment in wrestling, or those who allow wrestling promoters to do their thinking for them. Hits came from such heavyweights as the U.S. Army, the U.S. Air Force, M&M Mars and Atant. Many media outlets also aligned Wrigley's with this boycott, but they actually, with relatively little publicity, pulled out of WWF programming early in the year citing problems with the content. Ironically, 2 years after he predicted it and burned to his political death on the stake of Monday night ratings and apparent, mind-altering drug-induced booking, for publicly believing it, Eric Bischoff's prediction of the long term of this direction doesn't look nearly as out of touch. With all the bad publicity due to Hit and worried in particular about a Wall Street Journal article on November 30th, the WWF announced loudly that it was toning down its product. The decision was apparently made on November 27 by Vince McMahon to combat what were expected to be a series of negative media portrayals that would come out when word reached about the various sponsor pullouts, some of whom had yet to make up their mind but were clearly on the fence, but did in fact ending up pulling out. The losing of advertisers would actually have minimal short-term financial effect. The company's business is the strongest overall it has ever been, and any spots lost could be quickly filled during Christmas season by movie studios and video game companies. But in the long run, the negative media publicity and an apparent groundswell of the blue-chip advertisers as avoiding the product, particularly now that it's being publicly traded, is a long-term disaster. The theory of all the negative publicity over the past year as to the content of the show, its being any publicity being good publicity, with strong ratings to validate that theory, has forgotten the corollary to that simple evaluation. It's good publicity until the day it becomes bad. And then, often, it's too late. Any look back at pro wrestling in 1992 or the near death of UFC in recent years spells this out. An examination of the fall of UFC shows the lesson you need to know about this situation, falling dominoes, and logic, no matter what you believe to be right or fair, never entering into the equation. Coke pulling out, which the company said was not due to pressure from Bozell and the PTC, naturally caused other sponsors to question the product and increase the pressure from outside forces. Once the Army and Air Force pulled out last week, the domino game had begun. Atant and M&M Mars are heavyweight dominoes that fell next on November 29. The WWF had no choice but to respond by announcing it was toning down the product, because ignoring the fallout would have led to stock prices plummeting and more sponsors leaving. The announcement and the feeling it would stop the domino game led to a small drop in the price. At the close of business Tuesday, it was at 20th of January 8th. At the low end for stock that has ranged between 20 and 25 cents after its first day, but it avoided the big drop. So what does this all mean? According to Vince McMahon in the Wall Street Journal, you'll see less aggression, less colorful language, less sexuality. Some of the more controversial characters may not appear on a regular basis on Smackdown. Smackdown. Raw on November 28 featured the same content that has made the show a ratings smash. Women ripping at each other's clothes and a new busty fair maiden being left in her bra. Val Venus, who management had decreed would not be referred to as a porn star in recent weeks, was unabashedly referred to as such. And for the oft-stated statement by McMahon that WWF isn't as bad as other programs on television because they don't do murder and rape in their storyline. What exactly is a zonked-out woman with her marriage against her will being consummated how many times constitute if not a storyline rape, leaving a weak pay-per-view card on paper based on the crazed father seeking to avenge his virginal daughter's violation? But the toning down was to begin Thursday. See, that show doesn't count. Linda McMahon in an interview with this publication explained further. According to her, Raw will be about the same. She feels it's not even a product content issue, but the fact that Smackdown is being targeted by a right-wing group. For whatever reason, Probably the vastness of cable and the fact that PTC only monitors the networks, this group doesn't appear to know Raw exists. Which is why the pressure is coming now, because SmackDown is a network program. So SmackDown will change from TV 14 to TV PG, which really means nothing because these aren't movie ratings put on by an independent board, but simply chosen by the producers of the shows. Clearly, UPN was worried about the recent fallout, because the Thanksgiving SmackDown, unbeknownst to the WWF, was given a TV MA rating by the network. And what does that mean? Well, there will be changes, but according to Linda McMahon, they'll be so minor that the fans probably won't notice the difference. They'll tone down a little on the language and sexual innuendos. She called these changes an experiment. Clearly the company isn't looking to stray from the formula that has made them so successful while trying to at the same time pacify advertisers that they are eliminating the same problems that are what are largely responsible for that success. Get it? Will the women tearing at each other's clothes be allowed on SmackDown? Maybe yes. In giving an example of what might change, she said that a character such as the Godfather may not as often on SmackDown. Like the Godfather character appearing in, say 2 or 3 of every 5 episodes of SmackDown constitutes any kind of a significant change that should make a difference in advertisers wanting, or not wanting to be involved with a program or something that should be a headline story in newspapers around the country. According to Linda McMahon in the Wall Street Journal, the scorecard of the boycott as of November 30th, which she blames totally on the PTC, reads as follows. Coca-Cola pulled all its advertising out across the board, which amounts to several $1 million per year, and has increased its buys at rival WCW from $2 million to $3 million next year. The company decided to publicly go after Coke in press releases, because she said while Coke has the right to advertise and not advertise anywhere it wants to, they feel the decision was hypocritical based on television shows they are still sponsoring, including but not limited to rival WCW, which at this point hasn't had any advertisers pull away from despite that company's clear attempt to follow in the same path. Attan has pulled out of advertising on SmackDown, but will continue to advertise on other WWF shows. M&M she said will also continue to spend in the $5 million per year range on advertising WWF shows, but will no longer advertise on SmackDown. She labeled Attan and M&M as companies that are trying to avoid controversy. The Army has an advertising contract through March of 2000, and has indicated it won't renew it, but the McMahons have a meeting with them scheduled for next week to determine the future of their relationship. According to the Wall Street Journal article, most of the companies pulling out say it wasn't based on the PTC writing letters, but on its own reviews of the product. Coke said it would consider advertising on WWF if the product is revamped, but wouldn't make a decision based on the WWF statements until they saw the new product for themselves. Attan spokesman Burke Stinson said his company isn't likely to give them a second chance, citing, "Their reputation is too ensconced in the viewer's mind to accommodate a meaningful change." He also stated, "There is a generally awkward feeling in blue-chip America about aligning oneself with what critics call gratuitous violence, given events on school and college campuses. That sounds harsh, but it's hardly consistent considering their continued advertising on other WWF programming." Coke spokesman Bob Bertini said, "We feel the WWF had crossed the line in terms of content and language. We don't have those issues with the WCW." In an AB article, Bertini said that the shows crossed the line in terms of content, particularly in terms of language and storyline. "It's not about one episode or one particular character. It's what we observed over a period of time." The loss of Coke has opened the door to RC Cola, which will push a youth-oriented RC edge on WWF programming beginning in March. The fact WWF cut a deal with smaller RC also indicates failing to cut a deal with Coke's top rival, Pepsi. After viewing the programming in October, after viewing the shows themselves, it proved to be inconsistent with the messages we want to send to potential recruits and the American public, said Tim Valbett, the chief of advertising for the U.S. Air Force, to CNS News. The Air Force does not approve of, condone, or support the vile, vulgar behavior depicted on these shows. "We're advertising in a venue we know can best reach our audience," said Michael Shepard of Army Advertising to CNS News. "But we know that the public views advertisers as potential supporters of a program. So basically we fall back on our guidelines, which say we will not knowingly support any episode of any program that is sexually offensive, excessively violent, socially derogatory, or anything of that nature to the U.S. Army. And when programs overstep those bounds, then we stay out of them." Boesel lobbied Secretary of the Army Lou Caldera and congressional leaders to pull advertising from WWF SmackDown, not WWF in general, which is where the whole morality argument on all sides gets weird, on the guise it's using taxpayer money to finance the show. On SmackDown on November 26, the WWF urged fans to write to the U.S. Navy, which had not made a decision. On its website, WWF listed the addresses and phone numbers of all its major advertisers, asking fans to write, attempting to turn it into a freedom of expression and freedom of choice issue, blaming everything on Bozell, who has called Smackdown the most obnoxious, violent and pornographic show in the history of the Family Hour. The WWF is saying his goal is to get WWF programming thrown off the air. Burger King, which was targeted specifically this past week by the PTC, through spokesman Charles Nicholas, said they were staying with the WWF. "We are aware of the content issue, but the programming is within the appropriate content guidelines for prime time." While all this was going on and written literally days before the advertising fallout, Entertainment Weekly in the December 3rd issue with Steve Austin and Ivory on the cover, praised SmackDown as the most colorful success story of the new fall season. While the show only ranks usually around number 90 out of about 130 primetime shows, among teenage males it's consistently in the top 5. In between falling dominoes, Vince McMahon wrote a letter to all WWF advertisers that read, "The Parents Television Council is not about parents and is not a council. It is a fictitious name utilized and controlled by a right-wing zealot named L. Brent Bozell III, to masquerade his personal extreme views under the ruse that the council is a representative group of parents monitoring television on behalf of children. Bozell is the son of the speechwriter for former Senator Joseph McCarthy, and evidently has appointed himself some finely tuned calibrator of what is fit for all to see. Using McCarthy smear tactics, Bozell has attacked programs like the cartoon show Captain Planet and the Planeteers because it seeks to indoctrinate children and scare them into leftist political activism, has stated that the media panders to gays, that Bryant Gumbel is an insufferable leftist, and that Nelson Mandela is the leader of a terrorist movement. Bozell has been on a holy jihad for over a year attempting to get Howard Stern off the air, all the while writing a column for a newspaper owned by the Moonies. Bozell's actions have caused at least one advisory board member to resign, calling him overzealous and out of line. We at the World Wrestling Federation find Coca-Cola's decision to be discriminatory, hypocritical, and an affront to free speech. This is based on Coke's continued advertising support as reported by Nielsen AdViews of the TV-14 rated World Championship Wrestling, The Man Show, MTV's Real World, Ally McBeal, Baywatch, Silk Stockings, Dawson's Creek, Saturday Night Live, etc. The World Wrestling Federation believes that turning off a devoted and consistent television viewing base of tens of millions across the nation who watch the WWF week after week is a huge marketing mistake, especially when, according to MRI, MediaMark Research Incorporated, those fans index significantly above average for the consumption of carbonated beverages. This decision runs counter to Coke's stated marketing goal of increasing sales volume and could be the worst marketing decision since the fiasco introduction of New Coke. In simplifying a not-so-complex set of contradictions, companies that pulled out of all WWF advertising are at least consistent within the product and probably did so largely due to content and not outside pressure. Those who pulled out of SmackDown but advertise on Raw, no matter how they phrase it publicly, are likely doing so because of outside pressure. WWF's announced changes, if Raw really isn't to be affected, and the November 29th show certainly indicates that, means they really aren't addressing any real issues, just trying to say something to stop the dominoes from falling, whether it be other advertisers following suit, or potential drops in stock prices, at the same rate they did this past week. There are actual issues involved in this type of debate, such as whether it's appropriate to show a woman's mud wrestling match where a woman gets her bikini top ripped off on a show marketed so strongly to kids and teenagers, and like it's some brilliant marketing plan, or a shock that a show with content such as that is so popular with teenage boys. It's a question that is the crux of all this, that has nothing to do inherently with wrestling, but everything to do today with WWF wrestling. It's a very debatable issue and there are merits to both sides. But probably not a whole lot of all of this really has that much to do with that. Steve Austin's career as an active wrestler may not be in grave jeopardy based on results of further testing. Another of the company's 3 hottest stars, Mick Foley, also has his in-ring future apparently limited. Austin, real name Steve Williams, 34, the biggest merchandise seller in pro wrestling history, is expected to undergo a spinal operation shortly that may save his career. No date is set for the operation, under Dr. Henry Bauman of the Cleveland University Hospital, considered the best spinal surgeon in the country. The operation will be to remove a bone spur on his C4 vertebra. The bone spur is putting pressure on his spine and causing back pain and numbness in his hands and shoulders and involuntary twitching and jumping of his feet while sitting still. The surgery is said to be similar to an operation Bauman recently did on baseball superstar Cal Ripken Jr., who is expected to be able to play next season. While the demands on the spine in pro wrestling are very different from those in baseball, It is considered a much better possibility this week that Austin can return to wrestling as opposed to last week when it was generally believed based on preliminary diagnosis of his neck and back problems that he had wrestled his last match. After consultation with Dr. Joseph Torg in Philadelphia, who reviewed the myelogram done last week, considered the foremost neck specialist in the country, he diagnosed the bone spur as the main problem causing the numbness and recommended going to Baumann for an operation. Torg said that Austin should continue his current weight training program as well as do a lot of walking to try and maintain conditioning leading up to the surgery. After 4 to 6 weeks of rehabilitation after the surgery, more tests will be done to determine how much permanent damage was done already to his spinal cord. Dependent upon how much permanent damage has been done, that will determine his potential future, or lack thereof, as an active performer. It is believed that Austin won't be appearing at TV tapings before the surgery, but he will probably be talked about and they may tape segments from his home to talk about the surgery as a result of being run over by the car in the Survivor Series angle. After the rehab, the extent of wrestling he'll be allowed to do will probably determine what role he plays, which could range from no wrestling to being back in the ring for WrestleMania, although the angle has changed to where at this point it would be difficult to do the originally planned heel turn because of the sympathy of returning from surgery, and the timing would make it harder, but not necessarily impossible to have the belt on him several weeks before he showed to defend against Rock. Most likely if he would be able to wrestle, his opponent would be whomever is chosen to be the driver of the car that ran him down. The injury actually dates back to being momentarily paralyzed after being dropped wrong by Owen Hart on August 3, 1997, when his head was too low on a tombstone piledriver spot. Many roles, including television commentator, have been suggested for Austin if he can't return as an active wrestler, but it is virtually a certainty he'd remain under any circumstances a strong part of the television shows. Foley, also 34, is winding down his career due to the accumulation of all the injuries he's suffered. There has been a lot of talk this past week about a retirement announcement, and at one point there must have been plans of making one on the November 22 Raw, but with the uncertainty about Austin, the company didn't want to have it appear publicly that 2 of its 3 most popular performers were in danger of injury-induced retirements at the same time. However, Foley appeared on TSN's Off the Record, which was taped before the November 22 Raw for an air date on November 30, with the belief the announcement would be made on that show. On the TSN show, Michael Landsberg said that by the time this show airs, Foley will have announced his retirement. Foley then said he would be done soon as a regular character but would return and maybe a year or 2 later might come back for a big match. Foley told us that he and the WWF would not use the word retirement because he doesn't want to be one of those wrestlers who comes out of retirement, and that he's been given a lot of control in writing out how his full-time career will shortly end. On TSN, Foley said that he's happy to be getting out now because he doesn't want to end up a vegetable. Foley had decided some time back that he'd probably not last much further than the end of this year. Since returning from double knee surgery in August and getting his one-day title run, he's been unable to perform at near his former capabilities and has been very upfront about his declining ability, although he's been able to use comedy both in and out of the ring to keep himself at the forefront. He's noted that the list of things he could do in the ring has dwindled greatly over the past year, and now even the most basic of moves causes him pain. He's noted in the past not wanting to be like the Road Warriors, former legends who stayed past their prime so long that they became jokes within the business. Foley has also said that right now, for a variety of reasons, he has so much goodwill among fans that he can almost do no wrong, but that grace period, as he called it, won't last forever. The current plans, as have been vaguely laid out at this point, don't call for an actual retirement ceremony or farewell tour. It is expected Foley will do some sort of an angle over the next 2 months. It has been discussed for it to take place at the Royal Rumble in Madison Square Garden or shortly thereafter, which would in a sense lead to his exit as a full-time performer. Among the things talked about is to lead to him leaving temporarily as a wrestler and returning at some point to replace Shawn Michaels in the commissioner role and be a weekly part of television in that guise. There are a lot of major points that can be made about the life of Hiro Matsuda, who passed away from colon cancer that had spread to his kidneys, liver and stomach on November 26 at his home in Tampa at the age of 62. He was one of the true tough guys and great shooters of his era, the policeman of the Florida wrestling territory during most of its glory days. He trained numerous pro wrestling superstars, including 4 Hall of Famers and the most famous pro wrestler ever. He was the first native Japanese wrestler to ever capture an internationally recognized singles world championship, and came very close at one point to holding the most recognized world heavyweight championship on the planet, which would have arguably for a time made him just about the biggest star in the world. He was an astute businessman, both in and out of wrestling, and above all, was a self-made awesome athletic specimen, noted for being among the most well-conditioned athletes ever in pro wrestling. "I never saw him out of breath in any match and it didn't matter how fast you went," said his most noted ring rival, Danny Hodge, who once wrestled 5 90-minute matches in the course of 1 week against him for the NWA World Junior Heavyweight Championship during a time when that title had significance worldwide and was virtually always in the main event position on the card. There was no one in pro wrestling that could compare to him other than Luthez. And he was someone you'd be proud to associate with. Matsuda was diagnosed with cancer in February, but because of Japanese societal mores, kept it quiet and few in wrestling knew until the past week that he was even ill, at which point his condition was already grave. He had an operation in April to remove the cancer and 1 month later was back doing his daily exercise routine of 1,000 free squats along with his sit-ups and push-ups. But the cancer started taking its toll in the past few months and he was living with a lot of pain. While recognized as one of the greatest in-ring workers as well as shooters of his era, he was not someone who grew up on wrestling nor originally wanted to be a wrestler. Born Yasuhiro Kojima on July 23, 1937 in Yokohama, Japan, he was from a poor background growing up in post-World War II Japan, and always had the fantasy goal from childhood to find a way to the United States where he'd become a success, since he grew up enraptured by cowboy movies. He was a large man by Japanese standards, particularly of his time, eventually standing 6'2" and weighing 230 pounds. He went to the same high school that a few years earlier had produced Sadaharu Oh, one of the 2 or 3 biggest names in the history of Japanese baseball and still its all-time home run king with 862 round trippers. He was a good pitcher, good enough to be scouted by the Japanese Major League, but not good enough to get a contract. Frustrated that baseball wasn't going to be his ticket to the United States, and this almost sounds like a movie, his life changed one day when he saw a huge throng of people on the street watching television of the famous 60-minute draw from the old Korakuen baseball stadium between world champion Thez and Rikidozan on October 7, 1957. At that point he saw pro wrestling as his ticket to the United States. He summoned up the nerve to find out where Rikidozan lived, and showed up at the door of his mansion. After meeting his servant, he was invited in. Rikidozan took a liking to him and invited him to dinner. Kojima had come from a family so poor that he'd never eaten meat in his entire life, and was treated to a steak dinner which tasted like nothing he had ever eaten, and began training enthusiastically for pro wrestling. There are 2 stories of his falling out with Rikidozan a few months later. One version told by him was that he trained under Rikidozan, but as was customary in those days, was never told that pro wrestling was a work. Even as late as the late 70s, Japanese rookie wrestlers literally weren't told specifically the business was a work until their first pro match. Since his first opponent was an Olympic-caliber amateur, they never bothered to tell him before his first match, figuring he wasn't going to win anyway. Apparently he, not knowing any better, was a lot more dangerous than they had figured, and when he left the ring, Rikidozan slapped him hard across the face and told him that pro wrestling was a show and the object was to make your opponent look good. But Rikidozan loved his toughness, and with his size, felt he was marketable. But Rikidozan felt that he should first go into sumo wrestling, make a name for himself, and then he'd bring him back as a real sports star who he could promote to the top in pro wrestling. Matsuda didn't want to become a sumo wrestler, feeling sumo offered him no opportunity to go to the United States, and quit the stable. In Japan, the story was that Matsuda suffered an elbow injury training to wrestle, and that led to a problem leading to their eventual split. In later life, Matsuda would tell friends one of his biggest regrets was that he never was able to return to Japan and meet Rikidozan face-to-face and show him that he made it as a pro wrestling star without Rikidozan's help. By the time he truly made it as a name star in the US, Rikidozan was murdered before he could return to Japan. His best friend at the time, who was kind of like an older brother, was Isao Yoshihara, who later became a major pro wrestling promoter in Japan. After quitting Rikidozan's stable, he got a job working for his great-uncle who had an import/export business in Peru. Yoshihara saw him off on April 12, 1960, as he left Haneda Airport for Peru, where he'd work a regular job and began pro wrestling in Peru under the strange ring name of Ernest Kojima. With his Japanese training and his uncanny ability to quickly pick things up in the ring, he advanced quickly, wrestling throughout South and Central America and into Mexico. At that time, there was a different attitude toward Mexico from the promoters in the United States, particularly those in Texas and California who felt good Mexicans wrestlers equaled big box office, with lots of history showing that to be the case. So when the news got out there was a new star in Mexico, in this case a Japanese wrestler who really knew how to wrestle, he was quickly brought into the United States. By 1961, Houston promoter Morris Siegel had heard about Kojima, brought him in as the new tag team partner for the area's perennial top heel, Duke Kyomika, Duke Tanaka, father of current wrestler Pat Tanaka, and gave him the ring name of Hiro Matsuda. Hiro was short for Yasuhiro. Matsuda was named after two prominent Japanese stars of the past, Sorikichi Matsuda, the first Japanese-born pro wrestler in the United States in the 1880s, and 1920s wrestler Manny the Mighty Matsuda, who was a big star in Texas. His ring style was similar to later tag team partner Masa Saito, in that he did the Japanese stereotypical heel spots, but was allowed to display his legitimate wrestling talents in the midst of doing the gimmick. Not too many years later, the technical wrestling overwhelmed the gimmick to the point the Japanese gimmick spots were dropped completely. Over the next few years he wrestled in Oklahoma for Leroy McGuirk and Grizzly Smith, where he first worked with his most famous ring rival, Hodge, and later went to Kansas City for Gus Harris, where he roomed with Stan Stasiak and Gino Marella Gorilla Monsoon, before Eddie Graham brought him into Florida and he was one of the men the territory was built around. Florida wrestling in the 60s was built into a hotbed by Graham, real name Ed Gossett, who was considered the premier booking mind of his time and later was the teacher of booking principles to people like Bill Watts. It was a territory built on both gimmicks, as wild and crazy as they came, and credibility. The idea was to have a large dose of blood, gimmick matches and feuds, but the base of the promotion was always kept on the wrestling matches, and the top of the card would be based on good wrestlers having believable matches for titles with credibility. Florida was one of those places in the 60s where fans actually believed that while pro wrestling matches by and large may or may not have been real, the top matches, such as the title matches, there was little question they were. Matsuda by this point was one of the top technical wrestlers in the business, and he quickly became a headliner and one of the foundations in building the company, first as a heel with Kiyomika as his partner, later as a babyface and perhaps even more so outside the ring. On November 11, 1964, in Tampa, he became the first native Japanese wrestler to hold an internationally recognized world championship when he pinned Hodge to win the NWA World Junior Heavyweight title clean in the middle. Hodge was already a sports legend, particularly in his native Oklahoma where he was the top local wrestling star. He was arguably the greatest amateur wrestler America had ever produced up to that point in time, then a Golden Gloves national champion boxer, and when he decided to turn pro because his real background was so well known in that part of the country, he never lost and was in his rookie year made NWA World Junior Heavyweight champion. The NWA in those days loved showcasing real wrestlers or at least people with legitimate athletic credentials as champions, both as a way to promote wrestling to the sports writers to try and give it credibility it really didn't have, and also to have a tough man holding the belt to guard against attempted double crosses in the ring. For 4.5 years traveling around the U.S., Hodge never lost the title, and virtually never lost a match, usually only to heavyweight champ Thez, but the majority of those matches were draws. The fans in Oklahoma saw him as unbeatable, so when the tape of Hodge losing the title in Florida clean in the middle aired in that part of the country, fans were literally as stunned as the night Bruno Sammartino lost to Ivan Koloff in Madison Square Garden. It was also a huge news story in Japan, since a native Japanese wrestler had not only won what was considered a real pro wrestling world title, but had done so by beating a man regarded on the same plane as a wrestler as Thez and Karl Gotch. It was also exactly what the junior heavyweight division needed at the time. While the title was still considered very prestigious and Hodge was a respected star that McGuirk, who controlled the division, wanted to keep on top for obvious reasons, fans had gotten to the point where they didn't believe there was anyone of his size who could beat him. Although Hodge's quest to regain the title lasted only about 2 months, with Hodge winning it back in Tulsa, Hodge recalls it being the most successful program of his career. Hodge had to pick up wins over every top junior heavyweight in the country for several weeks to earn the rematch. The rematches around the circuit were 90-minute time limit matches which all went the distance, including 5 in 1 week. One match in Missouri, which at the time banned wrestling on Sunday, saw them start the main event before 11 p.m. and the two were in the ring exchanging holds until 12:01 a.m., when the Athletic Commission stopped the match due to the ban of wrestling on Sundays. They came back to the city the next week with the proviso the main event would start early in the evening. The matches consisted almost entirely of the two exchanging wrestling moves, with only an occasional karate thrust or punch thrown in to pick up the heat. It was known in the trade at the time as a championship-style match, and there weren't many men who could do it, even fewer of whom had the conditioning to do it regularly and had the shooting ability to be put as standard-bearer in something of an unholy alliance of largely unscrupulous promoters. Finally, in Tulsa, near his hometown of Perry, OK, Hodge pinned Matsuda to regain the title. I knew every time I stepped in the ring with him it would be a tremendous night both for me and for the fans, Hodge said, who noted that Matsuda was his only opponent in that era where they'd go into the ring and his local fans didn't know for sure that he would eventually win, which created a unique atmosphere and made him his best drawing opponent ever. You couldn't say that for a lot of the wrestlers then. The two were friends out of the ring. Matsuda, who did well in several outside wrestling business ventures, once went to Hodge with an idea about forming a company to market athletic wear, long before such wear became a fashion trend, and in particular tennis shoes. Hodge knew it was a good deal, but wrestling being what it was, Hodge said he reluctantly turned it down because he felt it wouldn't be good for the pro wrestling fans to find out that two bitter rivals in the ring were actually business partners outside it. After the title loss, he moved to Ohio where he perfected submission wrestling training under Carl Gotch and quickly gained a reputation as one of the most dangerous legitimate men in the sport, a reputation known to this day in Florida where for decades, largely due to Matsuda and a little from Saito, that wrestlers in Florida knew that all the Japanese wrestlers were legitimate shooters, which probably was more legend passed on because of stories told about Matsuda. When he returned to Florida, the company was built around main events with he and Kyomuka facing Graham and new babyface sensation Sammy Steamboat, another great legitimate wrestler from Hawaii, no relation to Ricky Steamboat. Although Ricky Steamboat was given the ring name Steamboat because promoters remembered how well Sammy Steamboat got over a generation earlier. In what Matsuda would later tell friends was the highlight of his career, during that year he drew a sellout crowd at the Fort Homer Hesterly Armory in Tampa, the site of the weekly Tuesday night matches for what seemed like a generation, going to a 60-minute draw with Thesz for the NWA heavyweight title. Matsuda would later go on to have numerous title matches with Thesz and later NWA champs like Kiniski and Dory Funk Jr., but the first match was the most special to him because Thesz was the man he watched on television against Rikitos and the first time he ever saw a wrestling match. He later wrestled in Tennessee, continuing his feud with Graham and Steamboat, this time with Kanji Inoki and Tonio Inoki as his partner. In May of 1966, he returned to Japan for the first time since leaving to embark on a pro wrestling career. At this point he and Kyomuka, who was actually Hawaiian but was one of the most famous of the 50s and 60s era salt-throwing stereotypical Japanese heels, went to Japan as conquering heroes, as they held a version of the NWA World Tag Team Championships and were the first Japanese team to come back to Japan to defend the titles. He and Michiaki Yoshimura also won the All-Asian Tag Team titles from Killer Carl Cox and Joe Carollo, then defended them going to a draw with Graham and Steamboat, before losing them to Graham and Cox on June 27, 1966 in Nagoya. The next day, Graham and Cox challenged for the world belts in the first title versus title match of its kind, losing via DQ to Matsuda and Kyomuka in Osaka. That tour saw Matsuda become the first Japanese wrestler to use Gotch's German suplex as a finisher, and he became regarded as the best technical Japanese wrestler. However, he quit the dominant JWA to be a major part of the first major promotional war in Japan as his one-time best friend Yoshihara started up the Tokyo Pro Wrestling Company using Matsuda, Inoki and Olympic star Saito as the top stars, running their first tour in January 1967 with Matsuda booking Hodge, Grizzly Smith, Luke Brown, Graham and Johnny Valentine with the first show on January 5, 1967 at Osaka Furitsu Gym headlined by Hodge retaining his title going to a 60-minute draw with Matsuda in what is still remembered as a legendary match in Japan. The promotion's second tour was disastrous in July, as the JWA pulled out all the big guns, resigning Inoki and forming the Inoki and Baba team, and booking both WWF champion Bruno Sammartino and NWA champion Gene Kiniski on the same tour along with Japanese legend The Destroyer. This built to a head-to-head confrontation on August 14, 1967 where both ran major shows in Osaka, with the JWA show headlined by the famous Baba vs. Kiniski world title match that drew 25,000 fans to the baseball stadium while the Yoshihara show didn't draw and the company then folded. Matsuda returned to Florida. Yoshihara started a second promotion in 1968 which also quickly closed, but his third promotion, with help from the AWA and Vern Gagne, ran for about 13 years as the first opposition promotion that lasted. Matsuda and Kyomuka each bought 5% ownership in Championship Wrestling from Florida Incorporated and held it until the company closed down. It was during this period that the Matsuda out-of-the-ring legend began. Graham used Matsuda as the company policeman. If there was a problem with a wrestler, they had to deal with Matsuda, and the physical penalties were harsh. Matsuda's conditioning was legendary, his wrestling skill was top of the line and he was one of the few men of the era who knew submissions and had no compunction about using them to hurt people. If a big fan or a loudmouth fan in town believed wrestling was fake and made noise or wanted to challenge one of the local wrestlers, Graham didn't ignore the challenges, but instead invited them to come to the gym and face Matsuda, whose job it was to put a hurting on them and teach them what wrestling was, to make sure they would tell their friends. The word around Tampa, and later the entire state, spread quickly. The stories became legendary. To some those stories might sound romantic, to others they sound sadistic. It was an ugly business in many ways, And that's what the promoters in that part of the country felt was necessary to prove to everyone in town that their illegitimate product was really legitimate. If someone approached the office and wanted to be a wrestler, they were sent to Matsuda, whose job it was to show them wrestling ain't easy. Graham's philosophy was that Matsuda would physically beat up anyone who wanted to be a wrestler, but if they took the punishment and then came back, then they'd prove they had heart, and Matsuda would then teach them wrestling and eventually allow them into their secret kayfabe society, having proven tough enough to deserve the spot and having physically paid the price of being allowed in on the secret. In 1968, when Kiniski was fed up as NWA World Heavyweight Champion after nearly 3 years and wanting off the hard road schedule, Graham strongly pushed for Matsuda to get the title, which at the time would make one almost a guaranteed wrestling legend for the rest of their career. With the exception of Dick Hutton, who had the real wrestling credentials but not the charisma, every NWA champion in the 50s, 60s and 70s became legendary figures in the business. Graham had just imported Jack Briscoe to be the resident shooter and franchise technical wrestling babyface. Of all the candidates, Matsuda, who by this point was over huge as a babyface in Florida, was the only one with all of what were considered the credentials necessary at the time. However, he was missing one. He was born in the wrong country. Graham, among the most powerful promoters in determining who would get the belt, found strong opposition to Matsuda on the grounds of the belief by some of the most influential promoters that the country wasn't ready for a Japanese wrestler to wear such a sacred title that the entire alliance was built around. As it turned out, the nod went to Dory Funk Jr., who became one of the greatest champions the company ever had. But even Dory Funk Sr. respected Matsuda from an ability standpoint, and to get Jr. ready as world champion brought Matsuda in to work a 60 minutes championship-style match on Amarillo television to get him ready for what life as champion would be like. He worked in the wrestling office, and in other business ventures, including running a health club in Tampa, which is where he trained wrestlers more as a hobby than as a business, so his career as a full-time wrestler wound down in the early 70s. But he remained a conditioning fanatic, and when needed, would make his return to the ring as a babyface with a major rep, or handle Graham's dirty work doing what was thought necessary at the time to protect the company. Matsuda had a second run as NWA Junior Heavyweight Champion, beating Ken Mantell on June 14, 1975 in St. Petersburg, largely to redo his title program from a decade earlier with Hodge. He finally dropping it back to Hodge on March 2, 1976 in Shreveport in what turned out to be Hodge's final major match of his career, as 13 days later Hodge broke his neck in an auto accident. Hodge did many years later come back for some minor league shows. For all real purposes, it not only ended his career, but it was the last time junior heavyweights were ever consistent main eventers in the United States, and really the last time the title really meant all that much. It was as NWA Junior Heavyweight Champ that Matsuda returned to Japan in December 1975, working his first and only tour for All Japan Pro Wrestling. In 1978, he went to New Japan, forming a Japanese heel group with Saito, Ryuma Go, Thunder Sugiyama, and Umanosuke Ueda, including losing a Tokyo Sumo Hall main event on December 16, 1978 to Inoki. Matsuda and Saito had a brief run as top heel team in New Japan, holding the old North American tag team titles, which they lost at the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles to Seiji Sakaguchi and Riki Choshu on June 15, 1979, in Choshu's first major title win of his career, and his career as a headliner pretty much ended at that point. After Graham committed suicide in 1985, the once powerful CWF promotion, as most of the regionals did at the time, fell deeply into debt. Matsuda took over as general manager, and cut expenses to where he was able to eliminate all the debt and had it back in the black when it closed its doors after a business partnership fell apart with Jim Crockett Jr. Matsuda's business relations with New Japan continued through his death. As word got to Japan he was gravely ill, the company sent one of his protégés, Osamu Nishimura, himself battling testicular cancer, to Florida to be with him in his dying days. His final career match was in late 1990 for New Japan, although he rarely wrestled in the 80s. As a way to get aging Carolina's favorite Johnny Weaver back in the spotlight, more as a coach for Dusty Rhodes to teach Rhodes the Sleeper to give him another rest hold that would get a pop in his repertoire, in 1987, Rhodes brought Matsuda in as a manager/wrestler for Luger to work a tag team feud. Even at the age of 50, Matsuda was notable for a fat-free physique and legs more muscular than any of the younger steroid users active in the business at the time, from all those mornings of doing thousands of free weight squats. His final televised role was a forgettable role in suit and tie as the quiet Japanese manager of Ric Flair and the Four Horsemen in 1989 after J.J. Dillon took a job with the WWF. It was George Scott's idea that since there was redneck American heat on the Japanese for buying American companies, they'd get heat by forming the J-Tex Corporation with Gary Hart, a Texas/Japan conglomerate which would buy the Four Horsemen, but the gimmick never took. After teaching them respect, as it was called in those days, Matsuda turned out a slew of future huge names in the business, including either being the primary trainer or helping train Hulk Hogan, Keiji Muto, Riki Choshu, Ted DiBiase, Lex Luger, Yoshiaki Yatsu, Hito Santana, Ron Simmons, Ed Gantner, Hercules Hernandez, Brian Blair, Dick Slater, Steve Kieran, Mike Graham, Nishimura and Paul Orndorff among others. When Terry Bollea, a gigantic powerhouse, showed up wanting to be a wrestler, Matsuda took him down and broke his ankle. Months later, when the ankle healed, and he came back, Matsuda felt he must have the guts to be a wrestler if after that he came back to try it again, and then trained him and they became good friends. Matsuda wasn't always right. One time a local high school wrestling champ from St. Petersburg, Bruce Moyne, wanted to be a pro wrestler. Matsuda tortured him until he puked on the gym floor and he made him clean it up. Sawyer never came back and Matsuda thought he didn't have the perseverance to ever make it. But just a few years later, he turned into one of the most talented men in the business under the name Mad Dog Buzz Sawyer, whose talent was such he was a major headliner in his early 20s, but due to drugs, his career flamed out quickly and he was dead at 32. Scott Hall was another who came to Matsuda and quit. Matsuda loved to tell friends that his greatest protege as far as wrestling ability was Muto, but that, surprisingly, the best conditioned athlete he ever coached was Luger. A lot of people in this business owe their careers to this man, said the president of the current incarnation of the NWA, Howard Brody, a longtime business associate of Matsuda. He opened a lot of doors for me and I was very fortunate to know him. Brody noted that Matsuda not only brought him into wrestling, but when he was down and out after a divorce, lent him $15,000 to get back on his feet. The two worked together from 1993 to 1997, syndicating old New Japan television tapes in Europe on a project called Ring Warriors. He remained active in wrestling until recent years, working as a talent liaison for WCW and New Japan until Eric Bischoff got power and dumped Matsuda for his friend Sonny Wanu. But despite his accomplishments, he remained somewhat humble about his standing in wrestling. Once, when he was invited to be a member of the Cauliflower Alley Club Hall of Fame, he turned down the induction, saying he felt he needed to accomplish one more big thing to be considered as a member of a wrestling Hall of Fame. He went to his death not accomplishing that final goal, which was to bring what he considered as a traditional serious style of pro wrestling back in the United States. He was the point man for a very serious attempt in 1993 to 1994 that never actually got off the ground. After Hogan had quit the WWF and was working for New Japan along with doing the TV show Thunder in Paradise, Matsuda and New Japan wanted to build and had agreed to fund a national American wrestling promotion around Hogan's name value. At that point in time, WCW was a struggling money pit and WWF was still reeling from all sorts of problems related to bad booking and governmental pressure on the steroid issue and operating heavily in the red. New Japan was the biggest wrestling company in the world. Hogan came very close to starting the company, but ultimately Bischoff made him the big offer and taking the guaranteed money would save him the headaches of actually having to run the company himself, and the rest is wrestling history. Without Hogan, New Japan and Matsuda felt the venture starting from scratch would have little chance of success and the idea was scrapped. New Japan will have a ceremony on its December 10th Osaka show honoring Matsuda. His memorial service will be held at 2 p.m. on December 5th at the Idlewild Baptist Church in Tampa. Hiro Matsuda. Career Title History. Source: Wrestling Title Histories 3rd edition, Japanese Wrestling Sources. NWA World Junior Heavyweight defeated Danny Hodge November 13, 1964 Tampa, lost to Danny Hodge January 1965 Tulsa, defeated Ken Mantell June 14, 1975 St. Petersburg, lost to Danny Hodge March 2, 1976. National Wrestling Federation North American Tag Team, with Masa Saito defeated Seiji Sakaguchi and Shozo Kobayashi April 5, 1979 Tokyo, lost to Seiji Sakaguchi and Riki Choshu June 15, 1979 Los Angeles. NWA Southern Heavyweight defeated Eddie Graham February 19, 1963 Tampa, lost to Eddie Graham August 1, 1963 Jacksonville, defeated Dale Lewis June 16, 1970 Tampa, lost to Great Mephisto Frankie Kane November 11, 1970 Jacksonville, defeated Great Mephisto October 2, 1970 Tallahassee, lost to Great Mephisto November 5, 1970 Jacksonville. NWA World Tag Team, Southeastern version, with Duke Kyomaka defeated Brute Bernard and Skull Murphy February 1964, lost to Brute Bernard and Skull Murphy February 18, 1964 Tampa, with Duke Kyomaka defeated Brute Bernard and Skull Murphy March 10, 1964 Tampa, lost to Don Curtis and Abe Jacobs May 5, 1964 Tampa, with Duke Kyomika defeated Eddie Graham and Sammy Steamboat March 22, 1965 Tampa, lost to Rip Hawk and Sweet Hansen August 3, 1965 Tampa, with Dick Steinborn defeated Kurt and Skull von Stroheim November 24, 1965 Jacksonville, titles vacated when the two split up their team. NWA World Tag Team, Tennessee/Alabama version, with Kanji Inoki, Antonio Inoki, defeated Eddie Graham and Sammy Steamboat January 24, 1966 Memphis, vacated titles when they returned to Japan. NWA Florida Tag Team, with Missouri Mauler defeated Lester Welch and the Gladiator, Ricky Hunter. May 27, 1969 Tampa lost to Jack Briscoe and Cyclone Negro July 22, 1969 Tampa, with Missouri Mauler defeated Jack Briscoe and Cyclone Negro August 5, 1969 Tampa, lost to Cyclone Negro and Sammy Steamboat September 3, 1969 Miami, with Tim Woods defeated Zodiac, Bob Orton Sr., and Taurus Dennis Hall July 5, 1972 Miami, lost to Ray Stevens and Nick Bockwinkel July 20, 1972 Tampa, with Bob Orton Sr. defeated Ray Stevens and Nick Bockwinkel August 15, 1972 Tampa, titles vacated when Orton Sr. and Matsuda split up team. All Asian Tag Team with Michiaki Yoshimura defeated Killer Carl Cox and Joe Carollo May 28, 1966 Sapporo, lost to Killer Carl Cox and Eddie Graham June 27, 1966 Nagoya. NWA Southern Tag Team, with Kanji Inoki defeated Masked Medics December 1965 Nashville, lost title January 11, 1966 as part of three-way match to Len Rossi and Mario Milano and Medics in Nashville. Japanese Television Rundown. November 13, New Japan. 1. Tenryu and Yasuda beat Sasaki and Nagata in 1443. Typical Japanese match which started slow and ended hot. It picked up with Tenryu pounding on Nagata. Nagata came back and used his Nagata lock on Yasuda but Tenryu saved. Tenryu delivered Sasaki's favorite Northern Lights bomb on Nagata, which caused Sasaki, who was not the legal man, to go crazy and put Tenryu in the power strangle, while Ref Masao Hattori pulled Sasaki off. Yasuda came in and used a double-arm suplex dropped into a powerbomb, similar to a Tiger Driver, on Nagata, then went into a half crab and finally a full crab and Nagata tapped out for a surprise finish. After the match they were playing up how the fall was scored and half the tag team champions to use this match to build up Tenryu and Yasuda as a future challenging team. 3¼ stars. 2. Liger and Wild Pegasus Benoit beat Atani and Takaiwa in a non-title match in 1510. The second half aired and it was just fantastic. This was Benoit at his best here, made better by working with someone of Atani's caliber. Atani and Benoit were tremendous. There was a notable drop in match quality when Liger worked with Takaiwa. Liger superplexed Takaiwa and Benoit delivered a diving headbutt to lead to an apparent finish as Benoit used a pescado on Atani outside the ring. Liger set up a Frankensteiner off the top, but Takaiwa blocked the move and turned it into a top rope powerbomb and a lariat while Atani got back in and delivered a springboard dropkick on Benoit. Takaiwa set up the triple bomb, but Liger turned it into a Hurricane Rana. Takaiwa got up and set up a Death Valley driver, but Liger turned it into a Rana for the pin. Finishing sequence was awesome. After the match, Benoit and Liger issued challenges saying they would only need one shot to take the tag titles. 4½ stars. 3. Akira and Wall Street beat Hiro Saito and Kojima in 11:18. Second half of the match aired. Akira worked almost the entire match and he's one of those really underrated guys. Kojima at one point turned Akira inside out with a lariat. Saito hit the senton twice on him and went to the top rope, but Akira dropkicked him. Wall Street then used a Samoan drop on Saito and Akira pinned him after a splash off the top rope. 3 stars. 4. Chono and NWO Sting beat Muto and Tenzan in 22:14. The last 15 minutes or so aired. Chono was in virtually the entire way. He's limited and NWO Sting isn't very good, so the idea they went 22 minutes doesn't look good, but it was because of largely Tenzan. Tenzan delivered 2 diving headbutts but missed the third. Tenzan did a form of a figure 4 on Chono and they did a great rope break spot. Chono doesn't take the dragon screw well and that's Muto's hot move, so that slightly hurt. Muto used the figure 4 but Chono reversed it into an inside cradle AD. The spot worked. Chono got the war special, a form of a reverse grip full Nelson, on Muto and they did a great rope break spot. Tenzan accidentally came off the top onto Muto. Sting then clotheslined him off the top and Chono shoulder blocked him off the top, to set up Chono using the Yakuza kick on Muto for the pin. Match built great. 3½ stars. November 14th All Japan. This was from November 13th Korakuen Hall, the first night of the tag team tournament. 1. Vader and Smith beat Misawa and Ogawa in 25-22. About 11 minutes aired on television. It appeared to be a very well laid out match, but there was something small missing in the execution. Finish saw Smith working over Ogawa, getting a near submission with a chicken wing crossface, but Ogawa made the ropes. Smith got near falls with a German suplex, an elbow off the top. Ogawa came back with an inside cradle. Smith used the Lynn cradle piledriver for a near fall before hooking his reverse DDT for the pin. 3 stars. 2. Kobashi and Akiyama beat Honda and Inoue in 17:08. The last 6 minutes aired. Kobashi and Akiyama are by leaps and bounds the best tag team in the business, as they even made this a good match. The big hot spot was Honda getting an STF on Akiyama while Inoue had Kobashi in the torture rack. Akiyama made the ropes to break it. Akiyama tagged out to Kobashi, who after a few exchanges of moves, pinned Honda after a lariat. 3 1/4 stars. 3. Hansen and Taue beat Hockfield and Albright in 11:41. Only 3 minutes of clips aired. It looked real bad. Hansen is pretty much immobile at this point and the other 3 aren't good enough to carry it. Albright was just about never in during the period that aired. Finish saw Hansen lariat Hockfield. Mexico. The November 26th Arena Mexico show drew in excess of 10,000 fans for a loaded show which included a 3-way hair match, an IWGP Junior title match plus the Legend of the Silver Mask tournament. In the hair match with Pierroth Jr., Brasso de Plata and Apollo Dantes, Pierroth Jr. beat both guys first. This left Plata versus Dantes in a singles match which Plata, who was covered with blood, won with a schoolboy and Dantes got his head shaved. After the match, Pierroth Jr. attacked Plata and they brawled until agreeing to a singles hair versus hair match for December 3rd, which is the final show of the Millennium at Arena Mexico. Jushin Liger pinned Shocker to retain the IWGP Junior title. Match was said to be good with Shocker, real name Jernariz Soria, having Liger pin when Tarzan Boy interfered and helped Liger. They did a rare one-fall title match in Mexico because the IWGP belt matches are one-fall since they are of Japanese origin. Ultimo Dragon was among the seconds for Liger in this match. Once again, the general feeling was that Liger was a disappointment, although those who have seen the match say Liger has a real problem now in that he has to live up to impossible expectations because in Mexico they constantly talk about him being the greatest technical wrestler in the world, and he was so much more spectacular when he used to appear in Mexico on tours from 1989 to 1994. Liger was booed heavily even though he was the face when he won, but was told it was a 3 stars match. The Legend of the Silver Mask 16-man tournament, which was basically an elimination-style match, said to have been super with one hot move after another, came down to El Hijo del Santo making Ultimo Guerrero submit to his father's favorite La Caballo, camel clutch. This set Santo up for a singles match against last year's winner, Scorpio Jr., on the December 3rd show, which also includes Gigante Silva and Rayo and Tinieblas Jr. vs. Universo 2000 and Cien Caras and Dantes and Ultimo Guerrero. December 3rd was originally to be the final show of the year at Arena Mexico, but they've now booked December 10th as the season ender, with it being the annual International Grand Prix tournament. They may finally do the Atlantis vs. Villano Tercero mask match on that show. The Liger vs. Shocker title match was set up on November 19th when Shocker and Scorpio Jr. and Mascara Anno 2000 beat Liger and Mr. Niebla and Tarzan Boy in straight falls when Shocker pinned Liger in the second fall after a low blow. Villano Tercero defeated Atlantis in 45 minutes to win the CMLL light heavyweight title that Atlantis has seemingly held forever on November 22nd in Tampico before a sellout 5,500 fans. V3 hit Atlantis with brass knucks to set up the pin. On November 27th in Lagos de Moreno, which is Cien Caras' hometown and he's something of a local legend there, Caras lost his hair against the mask of Rayo de Jalisco Jr. via a low blow DQ finish. This is a rematch of their legendary 1990 mask vs. mask match at Arena Mexico, which Rayo obviously won, which drew what is still the largest crowd ever at Arena Mexico, 23,000 fans in a 17,000-seat building with so many extras cramming the balcony that the weight caused structural damage in the building. I believe this is only the second time Caras has lost his hair, the other being to Conan. Also on the show, which drew a sellout 6,000 fans, Universo 2000, Cien's brother and also from Lagos de Moreno, captured the WWO World Heavyweight title beating the original Mascara Sagrada. With the business relations between WWF and EMLL falling apart, Mr. Aguila, who wrestles as Papi Chulo, and Taka Michinoku have moved to AAA and will be on the December 3rd TV taping in Tijuana. Miguel Perez is also headed in to join LLL, in the worked feud with AAA as an NWO-type outsider group, along with other Victor Quiñones wrestlers the Headhunters and Ricky Banderas. Hector Garza, recently fired by WCW, has been working here as well. December 3rd taping, which is expected to include a major international angle, has Alda and Cynthia Moreno versus Miss Janeth and Rossi Moreno, La Parca Jr. and Aguila and Banderas versus Psicosis, the AAA version not WCW version, and El Hijo del Espectro and Escorpión Negro. Taka and Blue Demon Jr. and Oriental versus Pirata Morgan and Abismo Negro and Electroshock and Main Event Octagon and Latin Lover and Heavy Metal and Garza versus Cibernetico and Perez and Headhunters. Pero Aguayo Jr. won a hair versus hair match over Cobarde 2 on November 19th in Tijuana. He also has a singles match no stips on a AAA TV taping on December 2nd against Perez. AAA's big show of the month is December 10th in Ciudad Madero, billed as War of the Titans headline, Octagon vs. Jockmate in a Chicago street fight. Jockmate has lived in Chicago for several years and came back probably to drop his mask for a big payoff, with the losing unmasking. Also the AAA vs. LLL has Canek and Dos Caras and El Alabrie vs. Cibernetico and Headhunters, Pero Aguayo Jr. and Heavy Metal vs. Adias Irazan and Kickboxer, Mascara Sagrada and La Parca Jr. and Hector Garza and Oriental vs. Abismo Negro and Electroshock and El Hijo del Solitario and a mystery partner. Plus Los Vipers Primera Clase defend the National Atomicosh 4-man titles against Los Vados Locos and a women's trios match. They are having a huge show on December 19th in Monterrey at the Bull Ring, promoted by the original Blackman, one of the great high flyers of the late 70s, which will include Mil Mascaras, Sahano, Tinieblas Jr. and Sr., Fishman and Carlos Colasetti, a late 60s star who worked California a lot in the 70s. Two third-generation villanos are set to debut on January 1st, Villano 2000 and Villano Jr. All Japan Tag Team Tournament standings as of December 1st were Stan Hansen and Akira Taue 4-1-1, 9 points. Vader and Johnny Smith 4-1-1, 9 points. Mitsuharu Misawa and Yoshinari Ogawa 4-1-1, 9 points. Kenta Kobashi and Jun Akiyama 3-1-2, 8 points. Johnny Ace and Mike Burton 3-2-1, 7 points. Yoshihiro Takayama and Takao Mori 2-5, 4 points. Tamon Honda and Masao Inoue 1-5, 2 points. And Gary Albright and Wolf Hockfield 1-5, 2 points. Misawa and Ogawa face Ace and Burton. Taue and Hansen face Vader and Smith, the winner of which clinches a spot in the finals, while Kobashi and Akiyama face Albright and Hockfield. The basic feeling is that Kobashi and Akiyama will win, that Misawa and Ogawa will be upset, and that whomever wins the Vader vs. Hansen team match will face Kobashi and Akiyama in the finals on December 3rd at Budokan Hall. Vader's left knee was injured on November 21st, but since this is the tag team tournament and the nature of the booking doesn't really allow for forfeits without screwing the complicated Rubik's Cube formula up, he hasn't missed any matches. Crowds were up this past week for the tag team tournament shows, including several full houses. November 24th in Akita before 2,300 had Smith and Vader over Inoue and Honda in 11:32 when Vader splashed Honda, and Ace and Burton over Takayama and Amori in 14:04 when Ace pinned Takayama with a Cobra Clutch suplex. November 26th in Niigata drew a sellout 3,100 with Ace and Burton over Inoue and Honda when Burton pinned Inoue and Misawa, and Ogawa beat Hansen and Taue when Misawa pinned Taue. November 27th in Sendai drew a sellout 3,500 with Misawa and Ogawa over Inoue and Honda when Ogawa pinned Inoue with a bridging back suplex, and Hansen and Taue over Amori and Takayama when Hansen pinned Takayama after a lariat. November 28th in Tota drew a sellout 3,600 with Amori and Takayama over Hockfield and Albright when Takayama pinned Hockfield with a German suplex in 13:01, and Hansen and Taue went to a 30-minute draw with Ace and Burton. November 30th in Osaka before 3,050 saw Misawa and Ogawa over Takayama and Amori in 17:32 when Ogawa pinned Amori and Taue, and Hansen beat Kobashi and Akiyama in 18:44 when Taue pinned Kobashi with a dynamic bomb. Ace in Japan was telling people this past week that he was going to be going to the new Fox Network promotion, which he said would be with Hogan as the top star. November 14th TV show did a 2.5 rating. New Japan. Hickson Gracie was at the New Japan office on November 24th talking with Tatsumi Fujinami. Atsushi Onita continued his angle building for his match with Riki Choshu. He announced on November 28th that he would be attending Senshu College, which is the same college Choshu graduated from about 100 years ago or so, and Onita also said that he would be joining the college wrestling team, which both Choshu and Hase Hiroshi in the past were both stars on. 4 matches were officially announced this week for the January 4th Tokyo Dome show: Muto vs. Chono for the IWGP Heavyweight title, Scott Norton vs. Don Frye, Jushin Liger vs. Koji Kanemoto for the IWGP Junior Heavyweight title. This was actually announced officially a few hours after Liger had lost the title to Juventud Guerrera, but the word hadn't reached Japan. So the belief is Liger will be winning the title back at Thunder or next week's Nitro. And Shinjiro Otani and Tatsuhito Takaiwa defending the IWGP Junior Tag titles against Minoru Tanaka and Kendo Kashin. Shinya Hashimoto returned to the New Japan office on November 29th, and they were talking about doing the match with Naoya Ogawa. Tickets were moving slowly for the January 4th show, but that's because none of the main events were announced, as the new matches hadn't been announced until November 30th in Japan. The office is apparently torn between putting the Ogawa-Hashimoto rematch on this show, since they may need it, or go with the original plan to hold it off until April to give them another Dome show. Ogawa returned from doing an NWA title defense on November 28th in Amsterdam, Holland beating Robbie Peters in 2:20 with a choke on November 30th, and reiterated that he wanted to fight Takada and not Hashimoto. He said that his right knee was bothering him, and in trying to play up his heel persona for the Hashimoto feud, said that he wanted stipulations for him to do a third match with Hashimoto, that if he won again, then New Japan would have to refund everyone's ticket money. Originally Muto was going to return this week, but between his mother's death and his knees being so bad, it's now not expected he'll work any shows this year except the December 10th Osaka show, since he's to headline with an IWGP title defense against Genichiro Tenryu. Muto has had 2 sets of cortisone shots to his knees administered, and the joint probably can only take 3 over the course of a lifetime. Since Muto is having problems even walking, which is the end result of 15 years of doing moonsaults, there is a lot of talk that he'll probably only be able to wrestle 1 more year. To make matters worse, Norton cancelled his appearances scheduled for this tour, with the announcement being made it was due to a family emergency. Masa Saito and Ref Masao Hattori left for Florida immediately upon hearing the news of Hiro Matsuda's death. Apparently more wrestlers would have come, except it came during the middle of a tour, and so many of the stars are already missing due to injuries. On Jeff Farmer's name change from NWO Sting to Super J, that was more his idea than something with major political significance. He just felt for his career long term in Japan, the NWO Sting name made him a copy, even though in Japan, actually NWO Sting is a bigger star than the real Sting, and was all played out. November 13th TV show did a 3.1 rating. Other Japan notes. The Japanese Women's Athena show on October 31st, which airs highlights of the major matches from several of the different groups, focusing on All Japan Women, and airs after midnight on the Fuji Network, drew a strong 4.1 rating, which actually beat out All Japan, which did a 4.0 that night, with the Misawa Vader title change. CMLL Japan's February 6th to February 15th Sky High final. Mil Mascara's theme song in the 70s when he was a huge draw was Sky High. We'll have Mil Mascara's Dos Caras plus a lightweight tournament called the Super L Cup. There were 2 very famous Super J Cups involving the top junior heavyweights in the world. Also on the tour, most of whom will be in the Super L Cup, are Atlantis, Volador Jr., Ricky Marvin, Max Bunny, Tortuga, Naohiro Hoshikawa, Masato Yakashiji, Ultimo Guerrero, Virus, Fugaz, Sangre Azteca, Super Cacao, Snowman Enigma, and Silverbat. Also on tour as heavyweights to oppose Mascaras and Caras will be Apollo Dantes, Rey Bucanero, and Scorpio Jr., along with a women's match involving Chikako Shiratori and La Diabolica. Virus captured the CMLL Japanese Super Lightweight title from Yakashiji on November 25th at Korakuen Hall. In an attempt to get Ayako Seiki, the 15-year-old 230-pound AJW rookie wrestler, over, they pulled some 60s publicity stunts out. She pulled 4 buses near the Tokyo Yoyogi Gym. The great Antonio is still remembered in Japan for doing that in the 60s, and Jos LeDuc used to do it in the 70s, and she ripped a 1,249-page Tokyo phone book. Yumi Akshita, 41, a top heel for AJW in a 1975 to 1981 career, will be inducted into the company's Hall of Fame at the December 8th Tokyo Yoyogi Gym 2 show. Akshita was a rival of the late Jackie Sato, and held the WWA Tag Team titles on 2 occasions, once with Shinobu Aso, and the second time with Mami Kumino as the Black Pair, who were the leading rivals of the Beauty Pair, Sato and Nancy Kumi, in the late 70s. She also had a 1-year run from February 21, 1980 through February 25, 1981 as All-Pacific Champ. FMW's tour from December 1st to December 12th is scheduled to be headlined by two Woo Brass Knucks tag title matches with champs Hisakatsu Oya and Tetsuhiro Kuroda defending against the new combination of the rivals in the main event of the Yokohama Arena show, H and Mr. Ganasuke. On December 11th at Korakuen Hall, there will be a Woo six-man title match with champs Riki Fuji and Flying Kid Ichihara and Chocoball Mukai defending against Gedo and Jado and Koji Nakagawa and Kentaro Kanemura defending the hardcore title against Axel Rotten. Toryumen's first shows of the new year will be January 16th at Korakuen Hall and January 30th in Yokkaichi. Shinobu Kondori will be having a semi-nude photo book released on her on December 8th. Boy, this world is strange when Kondori is now posing in books like that. Mitsuya Nagai, formerly with Rings and shortly with K1, has joined Battlers. Tiger Mask defends the British Commonwealth Junior title against Curry Man, Christopher Daniels, on December 14th in Niigata. On December 21st at Korakuen Hall they'll have a six-man with three great Sasukes. One is the original, one will be Yuki Ishikawa and not sure who will play the other one against Sasuke the Great. Won't this become confusing to watch? And Tiger Mask 2 and Fake Naniwa. Joey Fleisch from England, who did so well on his first tour as Doc Chan, along with Superboy and Curry Man are on the tour. LLPW held a press conference on November 25th to announce Shinobu Kondori's opponent in that company's first man vs. woman singles match which takes place December 9th at Korakuen Hall. They brought out three men Takeshi Ono, Mach Junji and Masao Orihara from Battlers. Kondori complained about all three saying she wanted to face better opponents and called all three children. They all attacked Kondori but she Ono. The opponent will end up being one of the three picked at ringside that night. This would only be the second male versus female singles match in the history of Japanese wrestling, with the other being the Koto Fuyuki vs. Linus Asuka match on July 22, 1997. FMW President Shoichi Arai announced that H and Mr. Ganasuke, who was the fake Hayabusa, would form a tag team on the December tour. In the December 11th version show at Yokohama Bunka Gym, in the Queen Version tag title match with Ayako Hamada and Mika Akino, defending against Itsuko Mita and Mima Shimoda. If Hamada and Mika lose the titles, then they have to become the protégés of Mita and Shimoda. Gia drew a sellout 2000 to Korakuen Hall on November 27th with a winner's advance tournament with a six-woman Gia squad, Shigusa Nagio, Sakura Hirota, Kaoru, Toshie Uematsu, Meiko Satomura and Tashio Yamada, against the six-woman Hill Nostradamus group, Asia Kong, Mayumi Ozaki, Kaori Nakayama, Akira Hokuto, Sugar Sato, and Chikeo Nagashima. It ended up with Yamada having to win three straight matches over Hokuto, Sato and Nagashima for the home team to win. Here and there. Buddy Rose, 50, real name Paul Pershman, although the local newspaper listed his age at 46, was arrested in Vancouver, Washington on November 18th on charges of second-degree assault on his wife, domestic violence and unlawful imprisonment. According to the local newspaper The Columbian, he denied the charge, only saying that his wife of 9 years had left him and threatened to divorce him, and he was released on $10,000 bail the next day. However, in his first appearance in Clark County Superior Court, the prosecutor Mike Dodds expressed concern about releasing Pershang because he had made threats to kill both his wife and himself, and Judge Robert Harris ordered him back into custody and set a new bail at $50,000. The story claimed that Tammy Pershman, 40, his wife, told police that her husband had relapsed into a cocaine addiction and that she had recently filed for divorce from him. She claimed that on November 16th, in their apartment, he came up from behind her with a kitchen knife saying, "You're not leaving me." Tammy Pershang claimed she begged for his life and he relented. At the same time, brother Gary Pershman flew in from Minneapolis after Paul had called him and talked of killing himself. Gary Pershman said he called up wrestler Ed Giovanetti, Moondog Moretti, who told him that Paul appeared to be serious in the threat. Paul Pershman's next court appearance is scheduled for December 13th. The wrongful death lawsuit from the heavily publicized January 1996 murder of former Olympic gold medalist David Schultz was settled out of court over the weekend. DuPont chemical heir John DuPont was found guilty of killing Schultz, who won a gold medal in the 1984 Olympics and was generally considered the most highly respected American wrestler of his generation. In the trial, DuPont was declared mentally ill and is serving a 13 to 30-year sentence. The lawsuit was settled out of court the day before the civil trial was set to begin. The amount of the settlement was kept sealed, but media reports list the figure agreed to as in excess of $35 million. Karl Gotch, 75, the legendary shooter and known in Japan as the god of pro wrestling, is in a lot of pain, needing hip replacement surgery to the point that he can no longer walk his dog. Minnesota Timberwolves play-by-play announcer Sean Grand, a longtime wrestling fan and Observer reader dating back to the 80s, wore white tape on his hand with TR for the late Tony Rumble, who he was friends with when he lived in Boston, on it during the November 17th game against the Los Angeles Clippers. It appears WWF is attempting to move Mike Tierney and Glenn Kulka from Memphis to ECW. The deal must basically be done since on TV on November 27, Kulka did a quick squash loss to Ali and Tierney lost a loser leaves town match to Steve Bradley when Kevin Christian threw rubbing alcohol in Tierney's eyes. They did the loser leaves match on television rather than building it to an arena show, which shows it was probably a quick decision. Also, Jerry Lawler has been taking off the Power Pro opening. They continued to use a lot of the Ohio Valley talent on the TV show like Scotty Saber, BJ Payne, Flash Flanagan and Trailer Park Trash, and were plugging Rico Constantino hard, although Jim Cornette wasn't there this week, with them saying he'd be banned. At the TV, fans were chanting Y2J at Saber, who has long blonde hair. Howard Lipkin, a Las Vegas promoter who at one point appeared to be the odds-on guy to get the TNN time slot before ECW secured the deal, is running a TV taping on December 3 in Lakeland, Florida to attempt to garner national syndication under the name WXO Wrestling. Ken Resnick, Chris Cruz and Stan Lane are to be the announcing team, and others involved in a backstage capacity include Ted DiBiase and Rene Goulet. The name we got listed as appearing as talent include Dan Severn, Barry Darsow, Eric Watts, Chad Fortune, Fred Ottman, Alex Porto, Barry Horowitz, and Manny Fernandez. The November 29 San Jose Mercury News had a huge front-page story on former area headliner Kenji Shibuya, now 78. Shibuya, who actually was born Robert Shibuya, Kenji was his younger brother's middle name, in Devil's Slide, Utah, and was Hawaiian, was one of the biggest stars in wrestling, particularly during the 60s, doing the stereotypical Japanese heel roll. He was a football star at the University of Hawaii. Shibuya, who wrestled full-time from 1951 to 1974 and in Northern California, ranks with Pat Patterson and Pepper Gomez and behind Ray Stevens as the most famous wrestlers to the mainstream public of the Roy Shire's big-time wrestling era, will be part of an exhibit on Japanese American sports that opens in March at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. It's noted that during his heyday, a lot of Japanese Americans were critical of Shibuya for playing into the white man's stereotype of what an evil Japanese was. Shibuya said he is unapologetic, saying, "I was only interested in making money. What did Shakespeare say? All the world's a stage, and we're all actors." Something like that. Brian Niia, who the curator of the exhibit honoring Shibuya, said that the Japanese wrestlers of the time were forced to play that role or have no job, saying, "I find nothing to criticize these guys about, because it was the only way they could have made a living in something related to sports." MMA. Semishal won the King of Pancrase title from Yuki Kondo with a choke sleeper in 2:28 on November 28 in Osaka at the Namihai Dome before a sellout 2,800 fans. This avenged the decision win by Kondo in their previous meeting. Shoni Carter, who has done very well in extreme challenge shows in the US, including a match with Pat Miletic that went to a decision that many feel he should have won, debuted on the card going to a draw with Takafumi Ito. Bob Staines, an unknown in the US, upset Rishi Yanagisawa in 1:53 when the ref stopped the match. That show was more notable for things not taking place in the ring. Apparently on November 2, when speaking at a college, Akira Maeda said something to the effect that Pancrase was fake. This resulted in Pancrase either threatening or actually filing a libel lawsuit against him. I believe at this point it's only a threat. However, the word got out at this show and Maeda grew up in Osaka and is something of a local hero there. There were a lot of threats made against Pancrase president Masami Ozaki by enraged fans, so Ozaki had Kengo Watanabe with him at all times at the show as his bodyguard, and the Osaka police were called for extra crowd control at the card due to the threats. Apparently Yoshiki Takahashi wants to get at Maeda as well. Pancrase also announced some rule changes for next year, the main one being that fighters will be wearing gloves and that punching while standing will be legal. The sport has apparently evolved to where the slapping standing style is losing its interest in Japan. Plus Pancrase without doing punches in their own style is having its fighters not fare well any longer in UFC-style competition. All the magazines had a ton of perfect photos of the Maeda Anjo incident since it took place right in front of photographers. Weekly Gong in the December 2 issue had a perfect cover photo of Anjo readying to throw the punch from behind to the side. From the photo, because of Maeda's reaction, it looks virtually impossible this was a work. The possibility of it being a work has been pretty well discounted everywhere once the police got involved so heavily, because if you know something is coming, you would automatically brace for it even if you shouldn't, and it's clear as the punch comes he has no idea anything is coming. made his eyes swelled shut almost immediately and hit a hell of a cut and was left face down on the floor right in front of about 24 witnesses. There was a big pro wrestling angle this past week at the Dreamstage Entertainment press conference to announce its January 30th Tokyo Dome show. They announced the tournament with the names already listed here. About 50 minutes into the press conference, Naoya Ogawa arrived late throwing a tantrum. This is all pro wrestling from this point on. Ogawa challenged Nobuhiko Takada to a singles match. They need a match like that for a dome show with a big angle. Ogawa said how the newspapers were already reporting the match taking place but that DSE hasn't told him. President Naohito Morishita announced that they would book Ogawa versus Takada as a first-round tournament match, but then Ogawa would have to enter the tournament, which he said he didn't want to. Ogawa again said he wasn't interested in doing the tournament and attacked Takada with flowers until Igor Vovchinchin, Gary Goodrich and Kazunari Murakami all broke it up. Morishita after this again said they wanted Ogawa in the tournament. Helio Gracie, the father of Rickson, Royler and Hoist and Brazilian fighting legend, was at the press conference and talked about Royler's loss to Kazushi Sakuraba, actually running down Sakuraba, saying that the match shouldn't have been stopped as Royler could have held on for the last minute, and said he didn't consider it a great accomplishment to take 29 minutes to beat a man 20 kilos, 44 pounds lighter, saying he's 87, could still beat a man 20 kilos lighter. Regarding the next UFC show, UFC Japan is also planning on a show in February. UFC itself doesn't want two shows in the same month for pay-per-view reasons, so most likely either the Japan or the Mexico show would be moved back. The current plan seems to be to have Kevin Randleman versus Pedro Rizzo for the heavyweight title in April. Finally saw the UFC Japan video. It was probably the deadest show, at least watching on tape. Due to the sound mixing and the fact Japanese fans react differently, it didn't have much crowd excitement, and that translates into the commentators becoming more explanatory and less excited when voicing it over. It hurt from a production standpoint having the announcers do it in studio after the event. James Worm, who by his own admission is not a TV interviewer, was stuck basically being one of the few Semaphore Entertainment Group employees at the show doing the interviews. I didn't think the matches themselves were particularly bad or particularly good, but the overall feel of the show was like it was being held together with scotch tape. The Kevin Randleman vs. Pete Williams title fight saw one exciting flurry late in the first round where, after a scramble, Williams decked Randleman and got on top of him in the mount and was hammering at him when the bell rang. The bell looked to have saved Randleman, who laid on his back for about 40 seconds after the round ended, but he was communicating throughout with ref John McCarthy, who didn't stop the fight. Over the next 3 rounds he continually took Williams down and held him there but never really damaged him. Williams nearly got an armbar in the second round, which was the only other near finish. Williams seemed tired, and by the 5th round, so was Randleman, so they were on their feet with Randleman behaving like a tired fighter, but Williams, the better striker, never could pull the trigger. Randleman deserved the decision, but it was far from a classic title match. The Pedro Rizzo vs. Tsuyoshi Kosaka match to determine the number 1 contender was an example of styles determining the outcome. Kosaka is the better of the two on the ground, but Rizzo was good enough at avoiding takedowns and Kosaka wasn't good enough at doing them, that the entire fight was on the feet, where Rizzo was stronger. Actually, Kosaka never even tried to take Rizzo down early. Rizzo started wearing on him with leg kicks, and Kosaka's legs started looking real bad. Finally, when Kosaka went for the takedowns, Rizzo was able to sprawl away. Rizzo eventually decked Kosaka, who then went for a takedown, and while going for it was met with a solid punch and was stunned, and the match was stopped. The way they match up, at least initially, Rizzo probably couldn't stop Randleman from taking him down because Randleman has a stronger takedown, but Randleman probably won't be able to finish him on the ground unless he can cut him, which may mean a long fight, and in long fights, conditioning often becomes the primary factor as opposed to which athlete has the dominant skill. Because of Kosaka, the paid attendance, it was largely a rings-oriented fan base live. Eugene Jackson vs. Kei Yamamiya, which Jackson won by a knockout, was a good match. All boxing standing, and Jackson finally put Yamamiya pancrase down. The spot where Jason DeLucia tore ligaments in his knee on a takedown from Joe Slick looked particularly gruesome. In the tournament, former pro wrestler Kenichi Yamamoto, who was never once referred to as a former pro wrestler in the commentary, won it. They didn't air on the US pay-per-view The Biggest Pop Live, which was Yamamoto challenging Kiyoshi Tamura to a real fight after the match. This was reminiscent of years ago, when Tamura, then up and coming, challenged Nobuhiko Takada to a real fight on a UWFI show in that company's dying days. In the Japanese wrestling magazines, the coverage of Yamamoto winning the tournament was the biggest news, even more than Kosaka's loss. and the heavyweight title match got martial arts mag coverage but little pro wrestling magazine coverage. UFC will be doing a taped pay-per-view show on December 31st, as it does every year, which will include replays of what are considered its two best ever championship fights, Maurice Smith's win over Mark Coleman and the recent Frank Shamrock win over Tito Ortiz. ECW. The November 27th ECW Arena show, which is the first show since the fans knew about the return of the Sandman, had one of the biggest advances in the building to date, and reports are they packed 1,700 in the building and definitely turned several hundred away. Even though Sandman gets amazing pops in most cities, this was the first and probably only city where his appearance appears to have led to an increase in attendance. The descriptions we've been told on the show ranged from bad to okay. Nova and Kid Cash, formerly David Cash, beat the Duck Brothers. Lynn beat Guido in a match where both Tajiri and Crazy interfered to set up their four-way program. Tajiri blew the mist at Guido, which led to Lynn pinning him as they teased the idea that Tajiri and Lynn are working together. Tajiri beat Ikuto Hidaka from Battlerts, who looks to be in through the end of January. Hidaka is really skinny, like 150 pounds, but has great potential since he's only worked a little over 2 years and is a great athlete in the ring. Because he's versed in the Battlerts work-shoot style, he's weak on American facials and American-style selling. Fans were chanting "Where's my egg rolls" at the beginning and laughing at them, but after the finish, gave both a standing ovation. I guess the egg rolls are equivalent to WWF fans chanting USA in the early 80s for British Bulldogs versus Sheik and Volkov matches. Except that it never happens. It would be the equivalent of two American wrestlers having a singles match in Japan and fans chanting "Where's my tostadas?" Diamond beat Jazz when Big Dick Hertz gave Jazz the penile implant. That sounds worse than it probably really is. Candido and Rhino beat During and Roadkill. You can see them pushing Candido and Rhino into the tag team title picture. Reports are that Candido and Sitch are doing better. Spike Dudley pinned Mikey Whipwreck, who seems to be back as a regular since he also worked Trenton, New Jersey the previous night. Rotten and Mahoney beat CW Anderson and Bill Wiles. Louis dangerously came out with Anderson and Wiles saying that he's reforming the Dangerous Alliance. I guess CW can be AA and Wiles can be Bobby Eaton. This didn't get over live apparently due to it being already 7 matches deep in the show before Anderson and Wiles came out. After the match, the Baldies attacked Rotten and Mahoney, leading to New Jack making the save. Angel laid out New Jack again at the end. It's pretty clear the Baldies are DeVito and Angel getting the TV push, and whomever else happens to be there that night with bald heads, this week being PN News and Vic Grimes, as the generic sidekicks. Van Dam pinned Uganda, Giant Kimala too. Sabu was on the stage and had another confrontation with Van Dam. Sandman beat Raven in a match with Dreamer as ref. All reports were that this match was terrible due to Sandman and totally overbooked. It wound up with run-ins by Rhino Candido, Lori Fullington, Sandman's wife, who in an angle years ago left Sandman for Raven and she never went back in the angle, but I guess she's back with him as she attacked Raven, Francine, Credible and Storm, and finally ended with Credible caning Raven and Sandman pinning him with a Russian leg sweep with the cane. Main event saw Awesome pin Credible after the powerbomb through a table. Match was said to be okay but didn't have much heat. Storm was at the shows but didn't wrestle due to an ear problem. John Cronus and Gary Wolfe, Pitbull #1, were backstage looking for work. As was Mike Lazansky, who was in a really bad auto accident and his face took a tremendous amount of damage. Mahoney worked this weekend but suffered bruised kidneys from his match on November 23rd in Yokohama, Japan against Kentaro Kanemura, taking a powerbomb off the car through 2 tables, when the tables didn't break. Still no sight for the January 9th pay-per-view show or lineup. The other house show this week was November 26th in Trenton, New Jersey before about 500 fans. Rhino beat Sandman in the main event. TNN show on November 26th was taped from Chicago on October 18th. The show was built around a confrontation on the subway with New Jack and the Baldies, built from the beginning to the end of the show. The show ended with Tony DeVito distracting New Jack and Angel hit him from behind and laid him out. The show also teased Jerry Lynn and Yoshihiro Tajiri being in cahoots. Joey Styles asked Lynn about it and Lynn told him to bleep off. Well, that's how it sounded on TV, anyway. Van Dam beat CW Anderson with a frog splash in 5:37 in a good TV squash. Anderson is a solid underrated worker. This led to Sabu coming out and challenging Van Dam. The chair spot where Sabu did the knee injury work looked awfully good. That takes some talent and guts to even work a spot like that. Candido and Rhino ran in and fans hated the run-in, feeling that it ruined a match they were into. After Van Dam got rid of them both after a running flip dive, the match continued with Sabu selling the knee. Van Dam kept working on until Fonzie threw in the towel, which Sabu threw out the first time, but the second time he threw the towel in over Sabu's head. Crazy vs. Guido had their typical good TV match but nothing out of the ordinary. Ref Jim Molyneux got bumped. A good spot was Big Sal interfering and going to powerbomb Crazy, but he turned it into a Hurricane Rana, which got a big pop since Sal is so enormous. Tajiri and Lin both ran in and Lin appeared to be going after Tajiri but clotheslined Crazy, and Tajiri gave him a brainbuster and Guido scored the pin. They kept teasing again whether Lin and Tajiri were working together. TV Main saw Credible and Storm and Rhino again beat Dreamer and Sandman and Raven in 5 minutes. First they beat up Dreamer and Raven came in for the save. Then it was 3-on-2. It wasn't until about 90 seconds into the match that Sandman's music even played. They did a series of fast spots, hit the cat fight spot and went right to the finish with Sandman caning Raven, and Credible pinning him. Syndicated show was also from Chicago. It opened with During and Roadkill over Dupp Brothers in 6:29. Bo Dupp does a gimmick where he keeps picking the seat of his pants. When are they going to have a guy whose gimmick is that he picks his nose and eats it? Bo and Jack wrestle and the guy outside the ring is called Puck. During looked really good. It's weird because his talents inside the ring are far better utilized working as a face, but his talents outside the ring almost demand him to be a punkish heel until the fans turn him face. He's going to be a star someday, and probably not all that far in the future either. Heyman has seen it for a while and Styles was pushing During and Roadkill hard on commentary. Roadkill has a weird kind of ECW charisma, like Hackmeyer's had, that may not translate elsewhere but can make him a cult favorite in ECW. He did a springboard double clothesline which looks impressive because of his size. Finish had During doing a really high leg drop off the top, which they call a panty drop, followed by Roadkill doing a splash off the top, which is the same move half of ECW uses as a finisher, this time called an Amish bomb. Condito pinned Simon Diamond in 4:08 with a headbutt off the top. Solid wrestling. Fans seem to groan at the big dick jokes. They announced the Limp Bizkit footage of the angle with Steve Corino, Rotten, New Jack and Mahoney would air next week on TNN. Originally Heyman wanted to air it first on this show. They ended with DeVito and Angel beating Rotten and Mahoney when the other generic baldies, this week being News and Rod Price, interfered and Mahoney got pinned in 3 minutes. This set up the New Jack run-in and there was a lot of blood and New Jack stapled Angel between the eyes and Price in the groin. It's the exact same run-in as always, with the music playing loud and crowd popping for the staple spots and hard weapon shots. The last move was Jack jumping off a 14-foot high balcony at the Aragon Theater with an hip/elbow through a table onto DeVito. ECW is trying to finalize a deal where both Masato Tanaka and Kentaro Kanemura would be coming in from December 17th to December 23rd. A correction on Elektra, who appeared with Danny during on the ECW TV promo a few weeks ago. She is not a stripper but is an in-house agent for 5 go-go bars in New Jersey and has trained in the past with Johnny Rods and Lillian Moolah Ellison. She's the same woman that was on WWF TV a few weeks back as a hoe who got splashed by Viscera. WCW. The Mayhem buy rate looks to be about 0.45, which would be about 165,000 buys or $2.16 million in company revenue. That's a 28.6% drop from last year's World War III of November pay-per-view show. Nitro on November 29th in Denver drew 10,086 paid and 2,795 comps, 1,600 shy of capacity, to the new Pepsi Arena for a $286,175 gross. The show opened with Goldberg, then Hall and Nash came out and issued a challenge. Sid showed up as well and they did a brawl in the ring with a quick pull-apart. They did a show-long sketch of Vito and Johnny. Tony Moreno was kept off TV this week after his less-than-stellar performance last week, inviting Mean Gene out to a strip club and leaving Gene there dancing with a half-dozen women while picking up 2 blondes, who may be brought into the Nitro Girls, and taking them home for a spaghetti dinner. Russo can at least argue that his Italian characters are as stereotypical as his Mexicans, even if they aren't really as demeaned. By the end of the show, the women tied them up, left, and called Disco and Lash LaRue, who poured the marinara sauce and spaghetti all over them. People are really going to believe in them as scary mob leg breakers. Can you imagine Taz in ECW doing that angle? Creative Control kept the tag titles, beating Bagwell and Booker T in 2:45 when Don hit Buff with a chair and did the switch for the pin. Hennig interfered to make it 3-on-2 till the lights went out and Midnight made the save. The former Ryan Shamrock was in a show-long sketch where they kept getting gifts from Maestro. Finally she showed up to meet with him and do whatever it was they were going to do, only to find a crazed David Flair in a wig wielding a tire iron with Maestro lying unconscious inside the piano. Somehow, because of Flair, that was a lot funnier than it reads. Jarrett hit Tenay with a guitar shot after a badly staged confrontation. Tenay comes across really fake when he tries to get confrontational. Tenay also received a head cut legit from the guitar shot. Finlay came out and killed Knobs, then gave him the worst haircut in history, so I guess we've got a hair versus hair match coming. Smiley was watching the monitor, and when he saw Finlay, he tried to hide under the desk and did his screaming. After that haircut, everyone should have hid from Finlay. Russo screamed at Control and told Hennig he'd have to wrestle midnight later in the show. I thought he was retired. He seemed scared. Juventud Guerrera beat Jushin Liger in 5:30 to win the IWGP Junior Heavyweight title. They did no introductions for this match. They didn't give either guy ring entrances. There was no belt. The announcers totally ignored the match. Guerrera tried a springboard plancha and ended up cracking his elbow on the floor. He was hospitalized for a possible broken elbow later that night. All of this went ignored by the announcers, as this was just a bunch of guys battling for the most important junior title in the business as a backdrop for them trying to get Brad Armstrong over with the same gimmick that made Van Hammer such a superstar. Armstrong, after calling Bobby Heenan Bobby Eaton, well, he's supposed to act stoned. But I wasn't sure what Heenan's excuse was on this show. Distracted Liger, allowing Guerrera to hit him with a tequila bottle for the pin. When this show airs in Japan, this will guaranteed be considered the historical low point of the IWGP Junior title. With Tenay injured and Gene trying to pick up some strippers, Chavo Guerrero Jr. did a job as a comedic interview, always trying to sell something. He was great in the role. Kevin Nash threw Hall's WCW TV title in the garbage can. They might as well dump all the belts there for all they are going to mean in the year 2000. Revolution did an interview. They're now anti-American heels. Douglas said, Iran #1 USA, PHFFT. Malenko started singing the Russian national anthem. Actually, Malenko is now named Python, Douglas is now named Rattler, and Asya is named Boa, while Saturn, doing his goof gimmick, is named Trouser. As they were running down the USA, here came Duggan in what would have been the worst angle on a normal wrestling show, as he beat on those guys who had to sell foam rubber 2 times 4 shots. Duggan laid out Douglas and Saturn with the foam rubber before they finally overpowered him. Finally made the save and worse everyone out with the foam rubber. Pretty soon wrestlers will start hitting each other with tampons as foreign objects. Flynn challenged anyone to come to the block. I guess one of the writers saw Fight Club. Hall kept the US title, pinning Sid in 2:58. Nash did commentary. Not sure which was worse, his commentary or the match. Ref bump immediately. Sid used a choke slam and powerbomb, but Nash ran in and first elbow dropped Hall when Sid moved, and Sid kicked Nash. Jarrett hit Sid with a guitar and put Hall on top for the pin. Goldberg gave Jarrett the spear and jackhammer. 2 of the Nitro girls had a food fight. The fans in Denver booed this out of the building. They were sticking food down each other's tops. A fat woman, is she the transvestite? Who was supposed to be in the mud wrestling match, started choking to death. Hoovy saved her with a Heimlich maneuver. Didn't I just see that Thursday on WWF? Hoovy didn't have the belt, nor was it mentioned. Jury only beat Steve Williams in a cage match in 2:30. Words like awful and terrible don't do this match justice. Only ended up needing some stitches because he busted his head. Absolute worst match of the year candidate. Snow vs. Bossman is no longer the worst cage match of this year. The rest of the Misfits and Vampiro attacked Ed Ferrara outside the ring and poured barbecue sauce on him. Williams threw only out the door, so only one. Hart beat Meng in 7:01 to keep the WCW title. Hall came out. Meng snapped his neck on the ropes in probably the worst looking spot in the last 20 years I've seen Bret Hart matches. Well, until the next match later in the show. Ref bump. Meng put the death grip on Hall. Nash hit Meng 9 times with the kendo stick and Nash powerbombed Meng. Hart was outside the ring and missed most of this. Benoit made the save, nailing everyone with the kendo stick, and Hart used the sharpshooter. Spice and Tigress of the Nitro girls actually had a worse looking fight than the food fight earlier. Fans hated this. Evan Karagias was on top of Medusa about to do it. I guess on Nitro they'd do it fully clothed. Medusa I guess agreed to do it only if Evan gave her a cruiserweight title shot. Imagine Medusa thinking putting out is only worth the 5 cents that title belt is worth these days. Hey Evan, she's using you, dumbass. Somewhere in here Lex told Russo he'd get Liz to do the mud match. Liz didn't want to do it and begged Sting to help her. Sting blew her off again. Of course, then he helped her. Sting is really weird. A number 1 contenders match with Sting vs. Jarrett vs. Benoit ended in 3:47. Unusually bad for a match with Benoit, but it wasn't his worst match of the night either. Liz distracted Sting and Luger hit Sting with a chair. Jarrett hit Benoit with a guitar. Dustin Rhodes then badly missed hitting Jarrett with the ring bell, but they figured why bother improvising, so Jarrett sold it and Benoit pinned him to win the match. Goldberg beat Nash in 1:43. Hall locked Sid in the dressing room. They doubled on Goldberg backstage until Sid broke down the door. It's the first door I've ever seen with no hinges. Hall hit Sid with a chair. Hall hit ref Johnny Boone with a chair and Boone reportedly got a legit concussion from that one. Hall realized he screwed up and then hit Goldberg with this terribly weak chair shot that Goldberg had to sell. Hart took the chair from Hall and hit Nash with it. Goldberg hit the spear and jackhammer. Hall and Nash then challenged all those guys to a cage match later in the show. Rhonda Singh, formerly Bertha Faye of WWF killing the entire women's wrestling division fame, came out for a mud match. Bet you didn't know that Rhonda went to the same high school of Bret Hart. Liz refused to do the mud match with her. Singh threw ref Roddy Piper in the mud. Piper spanked her. They threw mud all over each other. Creative Control ended up in the mud. Fans hated a lot of stuff this night, but they did like this. Piper ended up pinning Ron Harris and counting the pin himself even though he wasn't in the match. Yet another Nitro Girls fight, this time with Ty and newcomer Sky. This may have been worse than the other two. Whoever came up with the idea of having brawls with the Nitro Girls isn't looking good. Whoever continues to do it week after week is looking like the chimpanzees that follow Thunder that used to book Nitro. Flynn and the Wall went into the boiler room and fought. It went on way too long and fans were booing this unmercifully. At 4:50, Berlin hit Flynn with a pipe. Since Berlin was saving Wall from Flynn's lethal kicks, Wall responded by attacking Berlin. Chavo Jr. interviewed Piper. Piper talked about wrestling his father and his grandfather and then attacked Hall and Nash for no reason. Piper literally for years headlined every Friday night wrestling Chavo's father in his first program of his career, and did wrestle Gory when Gory came out of retirement in the 70s. Hennig beat Midnight in 2:58 via DQ. Midnight doesn't know how to even come off the ropes, so everyone can see she's a total amateur, which is exactly what this company doesn't need because it's loaded with them, but she does have potential and is clearly a better athlete than Chyna, but these Chyna ripoffs are a dime a dozen, and none of them mean shit. Lights went out. Stevie Ray attacked Hennig. Lights out again. Curly Bill hit the ring. Jesus Christ, you turn the lights out and the big surprise is Virgil? Lights out again. Arn Anderson attacked Curly Bill and then did that throat-slashing deal that would get him banned if he was playing in the NFL. Lex shoved Liz in the mud. Sting then shoved Lex in the mud. Lex actually was funny doing his mud spot, unlike Liz. Sting threw Luger's jacket into the mud. Liz got out of the mud and unintentionally slipped. A horrible three-way cage match with Goldberg and Vicious, Hart and Benoit and Hall and Nash with Piper as ref ended with Hart and Benoit winning. This was like going to one of those shows where everyone wrestled and they were supposed to come back out for the Battle Royal and nobody wants to and they all joke around. Hall got thrown into the cage, then right in front of the camera did the old too obvious blade job on the head, except it was a spoof since there was no blade or blood. Hall and Sid did a double clothesline spot I think the Nitro Girls could have improved on. Jarrett came out with a bunch of weapons. I was wondering, this being a cage match, how he was going to get the weapons in. Silly me, he just opened the door and walked in. He hit Piper with a guitar. He hit Goldberg with a guitar. Fans really hated Goldberg selling it. It wasn't heat on Jarrett, but the place groaning because they figured Goldberg would no-sell it. Jarrett gave Hall and Nash handcuffs and then they cuffed Hart. Benoit still won it with a headbutt off the top of the cage onto Hall. The post-match at least was good for a while. Jarrett hit Benoit with the guitar. Goldberg threw Jarrett into the cage. The cage was either so poorly put together that one side nearly collapsed, or more likely, a stop was planned where the cage was supposed to collapse but it didn't. Hall gave Goldberg the edge and Nash power-bombed Sid while Jarrett laid out Benoit. I guess Hart was just hanging out. Then they seemed to just stand around and stall with the dreaded dead air. I think everyone backstage was watching the wedding and forgot to end the show. As you can see, the main idea for the top angle in 2000 in tradition versus powers that be, with Hogan, Rhodes, Duggan, etc. don't know how Flair is supposed to figure in. Larry Zbyszko is tentatively figured in with the idea that the PTB will hate his announcing and fire him, and he'll come back as a wrestler, although the feeling is Zbyszko, 45, would want sizable money to wrestle as a regular again, and having been out of it for so many years, it's questionable what he'll be able to do is more than a one-time deal in the ring. It wasn't that long ago that Sabishko was over tremendously as a face, teasing a feud with Hall forever. But when he finally wrestled Hall, it was only a few minutes into the match when the fans turned on him. At this point, Tori Wilson's character has been dropped after a contract dispute. She was looking for a $250,000 per year 3-year deal. All I can say is that if they had any clue how to market, she'd be a deal at that price. If you look at how ratings have risen and fallen based on her appearance, her worth from a rating standpoint, and we know this company lives and dies by that, is sandwiched between Sting, $1.6 million per year, Ric Flair, $800,000, and based on his ratings drawing power over the past 3 years, he's way underpaid by company and even industry standards. And Scott Hall, $1.6 million, add Steve Williams vs. Vampiro to the Starrcade show. A correction from last week regarding the camera work in the Control vs. Conan and Kidman match. It was still awful, but it didn't miss the kiss. The reason the segment was so clumsy on TV is because it was booked that the cameras would catch Guerrero kissing Tori Wilson and Kidman would go ballistic. They even played the storyline up as if it happened even though we didn't see it. However, Guerrero actually refused to do the scene because of family considerations. In particular, he didn't want his kids seeing it. Another correction. When Hart won the title in Toronto, the kids in the ring were 3 of Bret's 4 children, as mentioned, but the others were Wayne Gretzky's children. Rey Mysterio Jr. and Ernest Miller both underwent knee surgery from Dr. Jim Andrews in Birmingham this past week. Mysterio Jr.'s surgery was taped for possible airing on television and was considered a success. Mysterio Jr.'s actual injury was the same torn ACL that he had before. He injured it doing the movie, blaming it on not having proper time to warm up before being sent out to do a scene. He was doing a spot that called for a Frankensteiner off the top rope, landed in a squat position and immediately heard the knee snap. He said he didn't want a reconstructive surgery because he felt Russo and Ferrara were giving him a chance, something previous bookers hadn't, but they told him they wanted him to take the time off because they wanted him back at 100. Hart in his Calgary Sun column this past week wrote this about Dynamite Kid's book: "One thing that didn't turn out like I thought it would, was Dynamite Kid's book. As great a wrestler as he was, I'm saddened to realize that in addition to injuring his elbows, knees, shoulders, and back, he's broken his brain too." From what we understand, Hart, who has taken copious notes and tapes of his entire career, noted from his own logbook numerous factual errors in Kid's book. Tom Billington responded on November 29, writing, "I won't deny there are things in the book that certain people, including Bret, might not like. The fact of the matter is the truth sometimes hurts, and whether people like it or not, everything in that book is true. But in saying that about me, it's a shame that Bret doesn't also remember just how much effort I put into getting him over in the ring in Stampede, in Japan, and in the WWF. I do. I remember it every single day." Billington also knocked Davey Boy Smith, saying that Smith claimed that his mother, before she died, and Billington's mother were on speaking terms when Billington said their families haven't spoken in years, and talked about an interview where Smith talked about he was training by practicing moonsaults, handsprings and nip-ups, responding by saying the truth is, well, you must have seen his matches recently. Also, when both squads were in Canada, DDP spoke with Big Show, who he helped out a lot when both were in WCW, and others about making a move. He's got about 2.5 years left on a $1.3 million per year guaranteed deal, but with WCW making budget cuts and that being one of the higher salaries for a guy not being positioned in that level anymore, there may be a chance they'd let him go. He has already asked for his release and apparently feels even with the big contract, that staying in WCW would result in him turning into Mark Marrow, a guy whose career goes down the toilet while his wife gets a big push. He no longer has Bischoff to protect his spot, and it doesn't appear he's in line for a push anywhere near the level he used to have. There was a backstage scuffle at about 2 p.m. before the November 29th Nitro in Denver, which Page wasn't even scheduled to be at, with Bagwell, which saw Page get in one good punch before it was quickly broken up by Terry Taylor. Reports are that Taylor may have injured his shoulder and that Doug Dillinger twisted his hamstring in breaking up the altercation. Dillinger for sure was selling to everyone that it was real, and people do think he himself believed it. Bagwell and Page have been friends in the past, so it's probable this is an angle, and Page is the type who would be into angles like this. There was a lot of suspicion by those who saw it, who weren't completely convinced one way or another, because it was obvious they had ample opportunity to actually fight and there was only one person pulling them apart. At this point, Page is claiming on the internet that the confrontation was real, blaming himself for being unprofessional, but that it will probably be turned into an angle. The word spread quickly, but to pretty well guarantee it, The word was out quickly they were fighting over Kimberly, which, if it were true, wouldn't have been actually put out, to make it believable to the boys, and that the company told certain people exactly what to say, which is how they handle these kind of angles, rather than tell them not to say anything. Even with WCW trying to restructure its wrestlers' salaries downward due to the steep decline in revenue from the business freefall, the perception of a top star jumping isn't something either side likes these days. One would think, based on the WWF salary structure, that he wouldn't be able to get a guarantee of half that, if even that, and there are a few, you could count them on one hand, WWF wrestlers who make more than $1.3 million, but it would be extremely wishful thinking to believe Page, without the political help he had at WCW, would be able to crack that list. Timing in this business is everything, and with Austin and Foley's futures questionable, WWF could use a few more top guys. But at 44, is the WWF willing to invest the time and push on Page for what is at best a temporary fix that could be spent on someone like Edge, who is nearly 20 years younger? The injury to Conan is a work, and he'll probably be kept out of the ring to sell the injury for a few weeks. They had him go to the house shows in Texas over the weekend where he was booked, with his arm in a sling, and not wrestle. However, with so many no-shows, they had him wrestle selling a separated shoulder and had him work short matches. They are making an effort to cut back on advertised no-shows now that house show attendance has dropped so low that they recognize all the sins when they were hot are haunting them now, and they have to worry about fan goodwill, something the company in its success under Bischoff got very arrogant about taking for granted. Kidman missed the weekend shows due to a neck injury. The neck has been bothering him for some time and he's been working through it, but it has progressively gotten even worse. Eddie Guerrero will be out of action about 2 weeks as he needs arthroscopic surgery on his elbow to remove bone chips from all the hard landings doing frog splashes plus years of weight training. When he wrestled Kidman on the November 22 Nitro, he was in tremendous pain and his elbow was badly swollen. Basically, due to the real and worked injuries, the filthy animals are eliminated for a few weeks. The plan for Roddy Piper is to referee short-term, probably just building to refereeing the Hart vs. Goldberg Starrcade match, after which point he's supposed to have a regular or semi-regular role on television doing the Piper's Pits, which is an interview segment he'll host reprising the role that first got him over in the WWF in 1984 to 1985. He's in so much pain from all his injuries that he may not wrestle again, or if he does, it will be very rare. At one point, the Evan Karagi's vs. Saturn match on November 22 Nitro was supposed to be a cruiserweight title match. Saturn was supposed to kill him, but not win clean, probably with a bunch of run-ins. Somewhere along the way they decided Saturn wasn't a cruiserweight and had him squash Karagi's. Christina Lon Kimona is now expected to sign here this week. Basically it's been Terry Taylor trying to get her in, and when Taylor switched companies, her odds of coming in increased at the company he switched to. Besides, WCW is trying to stock up on women. Vampira's actual injuries from the choke slam from Wall at the November 21 Mayhem pay-per-view were a mild concussion, 2 hairline rib fractures and a bruised collarbone. He's expected back in the ring for the December 6 Nitro. Insane Clown Posse had a meeting with WCW in Detroit on November 22 about returning, which from reports didn't go well, but they were still going to Denver trying to get back in since WWF basically closed the door on using them and ECW hasn't expressed any interest either. The November 30th tapings in Vail, Colorado are the last WCW Saturday night tapings unless things change from current plans. Between the holidays preemptions, this would give them enough shows to last until the end of the year. Jimmy Hart, Arn Anderson and Tony Schiavone had been in charge of the new show but never got the chance to do things as they wanted. Hart wanted to basically do his own small-time circuit with the Saturday show, with its own championship belts, feuds that would have nothing to do with Nitro and its own commissioner in Paul Orndorff. Hart at this point is no longer going to be running the new shows. As of now, the plans for WCW Saturday Night are that the 2-hour show starting next year would have 7 wrestling matches taped on Tuesdays, both before and after the Thunder tapings. The matches taped before Thunder would feature the younger guys they are trying to give experience to, some of whom have a lot of potential. Helix Skipper is the main one everyone is raving about, but Alan Funk has also gotten good mention along with Kid Romeo, good moves, good look but very small, and they have plans for Chuck Palumbo because of his size. The matches taped after Thunder is over would be using bigger names, since the bigger names will be attending the Thunder tapings starting next year. The Saturday night show will also feature 4 non-wrestling variety segments. The idea of doing a 1-hour show with Mark Madden, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash probably won't happen, but they'll likely be involved in these segments which are still being formulated, but ideas include On the Road with Hall and Nash and video packages including something described as a copy of the WWF's Deja Vu, Tony Schiavone actually received some death threats over the past week. Spice and Tigress were at the power plant for several hours training on November 21st, training for their November 22nd disaster. The common theme is that the show has never been better organized, but the two glaring weaknesses is that the production crew is clearly not up to the task at hand, and that Russo and Ferrara don't seem to recognize that there is far too much amateur hour material in the show, particularly putting people in the ring to wrestle that have no business in the ring, and the fans seeing through it and rejecting it vociferously on the air. House shows for the week were November 23rd in Toledo, Ohio for WCW Saturday Night, drawing 1,648, paying $39,936. November 26th in San Angelo, Texas drew 2,223, paying $44,415. November 27th in Belton, Texas drew 2,436, paying $53,565. We didn't get the figures for November 28th in Midland, Texas, but it was about the same as the other two nights. The shows were said to be really bad. In San Angelo, the ring broke in the Juventud Guerrera vs. Silver King match and nobody could take bumps in it the rest of the night. Buff Bagwell no-showed the tour with no reason given, so with Guerrero and Kidman also out, they had Wall vs. Berlin, which were beyond horrible matches with no heat and Harlem Heat. Instead of facing Guerrero and Kidman, wrestled Los Villanos. Main events were Sid beating Rick Steiner, in a match where they did nothing, and DDP, who in his TV storyline is supposed to be injured, over David Flair. WWF. Preliminary figures list the Survivor Series as doing 425,000 buys, which would be roughly a 1.14 buy rate and approximately $5.47 million in company revenue. This puts it ahead of the September and October pay-per-view shows, but well behind SummerSlam, which did about 600,000 buys but also based on pub should have done a lot better. Last year's Survivor Series did a 1.30 buy rate. Added to the December 12th pay-per-view are a tag team battle royal, Chyna vs. Jericho for the IC title, Hollies vs. Viscera and Ricochet, Ivory vs. Barbara Bush, or BB, the name they are giving the EMT getting the sable push of being stripped to her bra in every TV show, real name Kathy Dingman, in an evening gown match, Venus vs. Bulldog and Angle vs. Blackman. Mick Foley's book is expected to be listed as number 1 in the nonfiction section of the New York Times bestseller list on December 5th. For wrestling fans, that issue of the Times may end up being a collector's item in 20 years, kind of like the Danny Hodge cover issue of Sports Illustrated, which is worth more than $100 these days. Anyway, at least you're warned before you throw it away. In the November 28th list, the book is still at number 3. In the 3-month period ending October 29, August through October, the WWF grossed $88,267,000, which means the company is on track to gross $350 million over the course of a year if it can continue business at this level. Business expenses also rose and a major tax bill was paid, so in actuality, the profit for the quarter was $7,848,000, which is down from $12,234,000 for a similar period last year, even though at this point last year the 3-month gross was significantly lower at $53,412,000. Profits would have been in the $21 million range for the quarter alone, except for one-time expenses of an additional $7 million in tax because it was the quarter the company went public, and another $6 million in company payment for stock options to performers. Stock options for employees wouldn't be figured into the bottom line figures. For the previous quarter, the WWF profit was $20,278,000. This basically means that approximately 354,120 shares of common stock were given to Talent. Talent also had the option to buy as many shares as they wanted at $17 in addition. The key to this is that none of the stock options can come due in 3 years and all are dependent upon being with the company in 3 years. In other words, you'd figure there is a huge cash figure, probably in the case of the very top guys it could be several $100,000 or more, that they'd have in stock equity, but they'd lose it if they quit any time over the next 3 years. This was clearly done as a great incentive to keep the top players from jumping. The WWF this past week named former U.S. Senator and former Connecticut Governor Lowell Weicker Jr., former CBS Sports President Larry Kennan, and television syndicator Joe Perkins to complete its board of directors. As part of the stock offering, the company would name a board which would consist of 3 top employees, consisting of owner Vince McMahon, president and CEO Linda McMahon, and CFO August Liguori, along with 3 non-employees. Weicker Jr. was a U.S. Senator from 1979 to 1989 and Connecticut Governor from 1991 to 1995, and is currently on the board of directors of 5 other major companies including CompuWare, Kennan had a short-lived role as president of CBS Sports and was executive vice president of the USA Network. Perkins goes back to the late 1950s as a television syndicator for Capital Sports and is president of Communications Consultants Incorporated. November 29, Raw at the new Staples Arena in Los Angeles drew a sellout 13,222, paying $421,763. Please don't ask why they said 18,129 on television. Bossman and Viscera beat Show and Kane in 135 when X-Pac hit Kane with a weak chair shot and an even weaker X-Factor and Viscera splashed him. Viscera is awful. X-Pac gave Tori a spin kick and spit on her. DX came out. Triple H said there'd be no wedding. No shit. Vince came out and vowed to have a double juice match on pay-per-view. He didn't use those words, but if you translate his promises into Carney, I think he said it. He said he was going to give Test a wedding present, a match with Triple H on the show. Now keep in mind Test is marrying into a wealthy family with a billionaire as the father. You think he'd get him $1 million home, or at least a tanning bed. Edge beat Matt Hardy in 305 when Christian shoved Matt into the spear. Jeff was also involved. No heat, but of course they all worked hard. They did a show-long sketch where Stephanie was having her wedding party and they were getting her loaded. Somewhere in there Mae Young and Moolah double-teamed a male stripper. There's a lesson out there for all you budding male strippers. Take you steroids, pump your iron, and you two can dance for a bunch of pretty drunk women and end up in bed with Moolah. Anyway, the guy bringing the champagne was in cahoots with Triple H, and little did we know, must have put an H-bomb in the virtuous Stephanie's drink. Maybe Vince just read Dynamite Kid's book. Chyna challenged Jericho, but Jericho said he had a concussion from Thursday. Jericho talked about how she ruined his Thanksgiving dinner, forgetting that Smackdown aired after dinner time. It was pretty hilarious when Jericho talked about not being able to play with his kids on Thanksgiving. Kitty sprayed him with a fire extinguisher. No pop at all for that. Blackman pinned Godfather in 59 with a high kick. Too Cool beat Holly's in 51 when Christopher pinned Crash after a leg drop off the top. Rikishi gave Bob a bloated belly-to-belly after the match and bonsai'd him. Test beat Triple H in 820. Vince, wearing a Vince McMahon mask, was the ref. He totally favored Triple H. Triple H had Test pinned but Vince wouldn't count, so Triple H decked him. Shane came out and hit Triple H with a chair. Test came off the top and Vince fast counted him. Triple H told police that Vince had violated his order where he couldn't come within 50 feet of him. The cops checked it out, going to Patterson and Briscoe, who claimed Vince was in the bathroom and they could prove it by the cops smelling the bathroom. Vince was wearing gloves, so I guess there were no fingerprints in the ring. How about DNA? The EMT came out. She was given a name, Barbara Bush, or BB for short. Ivory ran her down and ripped her shirt off. She's the new Sable. Angle pinned Venus with his reverse fireman's carry in 318 after Bulldog hit Venus with a chair. They did some hilarious interplay with Rock, Snow, and Foley. They stuck Foley with Snow and all it did was mean every time Foley was on the show, the ratings went down. Stick Rock with Snow every segment and guaranteed Al won't make -100 ratings points for the year. X-Pac and Outlaws beat Rock and Foley and Kane via DQ in 420 when Snow interfered to save Foley, but it was just as Rock had Mr. Ass pinned. Rock was mad at Snow for costing him the match, so he gave him a people's elbow. Dudleys and Acolytes brawled backstage after both were trying to cheat the other at cards, and Bubba got a hand with 6 aces. Then came the big wedding. The director of this TV show is the bomb. The way they shot the faces and shot this wedding. WCW on its best day couldn't touch this production. It was a little weird when they announced the groomsmen by their wrestling names, in particular Edge and Christian walking down with women with real names. I mean, if the women were called Tori and Luna, it wouldn't be as silly. Then, to make things sillier, Test came out to his entrance music, and he was announced not as Andrew Martin, but as Test. That silly family putting out all those wedding invitations should have listed him as Test, not Andrew J. Remind me if I ever attend the wedding of a wrestler and he comes out to his entrance music with his gimmick name to object to the wedding on the grounds he's totally lost it. When they told if anyone should speak now or forever hold their peace, Triple H came out, showed a video of Steph passed out from being spiked by the guy in the hotel. They drove to a quickie wedding chapel in Vegas and somehow Triple H married Stephanie. And just before the show went off the air, Triple H mentioned that they had consummated the marriage many times that evening. Smackdown tapings on November 30th from the Anaheim Pond. The show opened with a few dark matches, as Mike Bell and a wrestler whose name I didn't get, sounded like Aaron Baker, who is a bodybuilder in LA training to be a wrestler but not sure, and each had a valet, and they set up an ECW cat fight spot with Bell going over. Papi Chulo beat Tom Howard. Again, due to the sound system problem, every report got Howard's name wrong. Steve Bradley beat Christopher Daniels, which actually sounds like a good match. For Heat, they built it around Posse twice attacking Acolytes, leading to the main event where Acolytes killer them. Also, Venus beat Albert, Taka beat Mark Henry when Funaki hit Henry with a flagpole. Bossman beat Godfather when Albert distracted him and Bossman used the stick. Smackdown opened with Vince with a bat. Stephanie, who was loudly booed every time she came out, told Vince and Shane that she wanted to handle the situation herself, that she blamed herself for everything and made them promise not to do anything to Triple H. The fans popped big in a face way when they showed a tape of X-Pac kicking Tori. Viscera beat Kane via countout when X-Pac grabbed Tori and Kane chased him. After the match, Kane choke slammed Viscera. At this point the show was held up live for 10 minutes due to a fight in the stands. Dudleys beat Edge and Christian. Edge worked an ankle injury and Christian got double-teamed and pinned in a solid match. Acolytes went after the Dudley afterwards. They did several skits with Rock, Mankind and Snow, with Snow attacking Rock to build up a match. DX did an interview talking about their pay-per-view match with Rock and Mankind and their TV main later in the show. Jericho beat Foley when Chyna attacked Jericho and laid him out, but Foley was distracted by Miss Kitty and Jericho schoolboyed him. Angle and Blackman beat Headbangers. They teased an Angle/Blackman breakup after. Stephanie did another interview and got booed out of the place. Test basically walked out on her. After that was another crowd problem holding up the show for 10 minutes. Rikishi pinned Crash Holly. Rock beat Al Snow. Outlaws ran in after the match. TV main saw Show and Hardys beat X-Pac and Outlaws in a very good match. After the match, Bossman ran in, which brought out Rock. The show ended off the air with Rock, Mankind and Kane each giving a DX member a people's elbow. In a correction regarding the Owen Hart A&E piece, Foley was never told not to cooperate with the piece. He was asked by the people doing the piece and agreed, but had never received any word from anyone that doing so wouldn't be a good idea, nor has anyone said anything negative about his participation since the piece aired. Others that were contacted by High Road Productions from the WWF to participate in the show turned them down, saying the company wouldn't allow anyone to participate. Notes from the Thanksgiving Night Smackdown, taped on November 23 in Rochester, New York. Show opened with dark matches that included Joe E. legend Tom Howard, who has been wrestling by the name on the recent dark matches, so in places where you've read about Tom Power or a name close to Howard that wasn't Howard, it should be blamed on a bad sound system, and Steve Bradley. For Heat, Albert pinned Henry with a high kick. Henry limped to the back. Gangrel pinned Blackman and Headbangers over Taka and Funaki in a sloppy match. Main was a three-way with Edge and Christian, Acolytes and Dudleys, with Bradshaw pinning Bubba after a clothesline right after the Dudleys gave Edge the 3D. Smackdown opened with lots of replays. In the replays you could see all the protective mats on the floor where Triple H took the bump off the stage, not that he wasn't falling a long way onto those mats. DX had Vince served with a restraining order. Big Show did an interview but Jericho interrupted to lead to a title match. This was 322 with a lot of mistimed spots. Bossman showed up and he and Show brawled outside the ring with the ref. Chyna ran in and hit Jericho with a hammer and they added a sound effect to the tape of a hammer hitting a skull. And Show choke slammed him for the pin. Mae Young and Moolah were at ringside dressed like a pilgrim and a turkey, with Young doing her drunk old lady gimmick. Angle pinned Brown with a back suplex in 149. This gimmick Angle has was pretty clever for introducing him, but it needs to add some depth or it'll get stale in a hurry. That deal where you encourage fans to yell boring at your matches did wonders for the careers of Furnace and La Fawn. Remember them? They were considered one of the best tag teams in the world, came to WWF, were given the gimmick that they were boring, and now aren't even remembered well enough to be Where Are They Nows? Venus beat Bulldog via DQ in 137 for a low blow. DX invited a bunch of homeless people in the building for Thanksgiving dinner. They did sketches the rest of the show where they teased giving them food, but eventually kicked them out without serving them. Never fear, compassionate Vince would never deprive a hungry man of a warm meal, and he invited them back in for a feast before the show ended. Bossman beat Kane in 341 of a hardcore title match. They brawled in the stands and in the hockey penalty box. Bossman had the penalty box door and a building door slammed his hand. Albert hit Kane with a pipe after Kane was distracted by talking to Tori, who was in fear after being hit on by Viscera. Rock and Mankind beat Hollies in 243 with the people's elbow on Cash. Rock ate a pie on the table which was called Poontang Pie. He brought it to Michael Cole and made a remark like this was the first Poontang Pie he'd ever had. Al Snow was watching the match jealous of Rock. The gimmick is hilarious, but again, the only destination is Rock vs. Snow, and that's not going to be a serious program. They pushed Schwarzenegger's movie hard. Fatu as Yokozuna sat on abs in 143 and gave him a pretty cool and scary-looking tombstone piledriver for the pin. They killed Rodney and Pete Gas after the match as well. Too Cool and Fatu all danced when it was over. A gravy match with Jacqueline vs. Ivory saw Jacqueline win in 108. Miss Kitty was ref. It looked pretty demeaning. It was actually there for a spot where Kitty would fake choking to death on a mushroom and the blonde EMT tried to save her. Kitty then ripped her, Kathy Dingman, shirt off, leaving her in her black bra with these ridiculously stripper-sized implants. Godfather, who was back to being a pimp on Smackdown, pinned Snow after a schoolboy after a spot where Snow went to hit him with a chair. Hit the ropes and the chair was to rebound on Snow's head. The spot couldn't have looked much worse than it did. Outlaws kept the tag titles, beating Hardys in a cage in 444. Road Dogg did a moonsault block off the top rope. Matt did a moonsault block off the top of the cage. After a ref bump, Jeff took a bump over the top of the cage to the floor, and thus they should have won the belts. But the ref didn't see it, and X-Pac ran in and threw Jeff back into the ring. X-Pac interfered in the ring, allowing Gunn to escape for the win. TV Main saw X-Pac and Triple H over Shane and Test in 523. Shane looked pretty green here with his selling. Gunn interfered, attacking Test, leading to X-Pac using the X-Factor. DX was destroying Shane in the ring after throwing Test out. Vince couldn't save him because of the restraining order, so he sent basically all the wrestlers into the ring, and it turned into a giant food fight, with the show ending with Moolah throwing a pie in Lawler's face. Ken Shamrock will be cleared to return in mid-December, probably shortly after the Armageddon pay-per-view. His injury was diagnosed as a soft tissue sprain of the cervical spine. The diagnosis is that there is a better chance than usual that down the road, due to all his injuries dating back to a neck fusion from a broken neck suffered in high school, that he will suffer neck problems. There is no word one way or the other whether he'll be able to return to fighting. The WWF The Music Volume 4 actually fell in this week's Billboard charts to number 28, scanning 67,188 units. WCW Mayhem opened at number 40 with 49,235 units scanned. There are problems with wrestling fans with both CDs. The WCW CD has a lot of music that wrestling fans don't care about, as Tommy Boy filled it with non-wrestling related music. The WWF CD is considered weaker than Volume 3 because Volume 3 consisted of songs that had a lot of television airplay as entrance music before it was released, where Volume 4 has a lot of new music with little airplay thus far. The November 19th Nash Bridges with Steve Austin finished with an 8.3 rating, making it number 50 out of about 130 prime time shows. For reasons we're not clear of, WWF didn't promote this on its television at all, and the result was that Austin meant nothing to the ratings. The first episode he did last year finished in the top 30, which was the highest finish the show has ever done in the Nielsen ratings. It's pretty clear Austin is a major ratings draw, for that show was a one-time novelty. The show finished number 55 the previous week. Austin is scheduled to film a second episode this season in January. The November 20th Walker Texas Ranger, which featured Frank Shamrock and Randy Savage in guest roles, did an 8.4 rating, finishing at number 49. That was a small jump from number 59 the previous week. Unlike Austin, nobody expected either of them have the mainstream star power to affect ratings. Smackdown on November 18th, which did a 4.6 rating, was number 92 that week. UPN finished in the time slot behind everything on the networks except the WB shows. Fitness model Trish Stratus, who was backstage at the Mayhem pay-per-view and worked on the Law Wrestling Radio/internet show, has been signed to a 3-year developmental deal with the idea that she'd be an in-ring wrestler with the proviso that no nudity is involved. She's turned down offers for magazine layouts and fitness nudity layouts in the past. She's been on many bodybuilding mag covers. Generally, the Canadian-based Muscle Mag International features her prominently, including on last month's cover. Terry Taylor had talked with Stratus about coming into WCW, and there had even been talks with Raven and her about coming into ECW when ECW held its pay-per-view show in Buffalo. Stratus has been training for about 6 weeks in Toronto with Ron Hutchison, but has been interested in doing wrestling for a lot longer than that. The UPN special on November 30th was originally to be hosted by Foley and Miss Kitty, but UPN officials, after seeing the byplay on the Las Vegas sketch with Foley and Snow, asked for Snow to be involved. From sources who were right there and not affiliated with either person or either company, the entire D'Lo Brown, Mike Graham deal was blown out of proportion, but despite other reports that nothing happened, it wouldn't be true either, although the reports were that nothing happened that should have even been reported as anything newsworthy. The two were talking, And Brown made a joke saying something like, "You old guys will do anything for a paycheck." He was joking around with others that night as well, but it was clearly not meant seriously. Graham didn't take it as a joke and came back with a line to the effect of having wrestled for 25 years and never crippled anyone, which is of course a sensitive topic because of the incident with Darren Drozdov. Arn Anderson pulled Graham away and talked with him, and Graham came back and the two shook hands and from that point on acted like nothing that happened. This entire situation was said to have taken 5 minutes tops. Scott Hall's involvement in said situation was said to be limited to being there and staggering around looking for people to go with him to a local strip club. Regarding reports of an imminent Brown jump to WCW, and it has been talked about within WCW, there has become a big internet war. The WCW hotline claimed Brown's contract would be up in 2 months and he was close to coming. Jim Ross, who is in charge of signing wrestlers for the WWF, said Brown's contract had 18 months before it expired. WCW sources claim Brown still has an out in his contract in January and is expected to jump. One thing is for sure, that when Gene Okerlund on the WCW hotline claimed that Rock's contract was running out and he was close to jumping, it was a totally fabricated story as he's got something like 4 years left. But the thing about internet stories now is that no matter how big a lie by a source proven to make things up on a regular basis, the story is given credibility. Godfather signed a 3-year contract. With the exception of Farouk, I believe Godfather would be the oldest full-time wrestler on the roster, 38, a situation that I don't expect to last much longer, and that isn't a hint of anyone old leaving. The WWF-themed restaurant at Times Square is now scheduled to open on January 19th, so they didn't make their Christmas or New Year's Eve hoped-for opening date. Adam Copeland will be doing a movie Highlander filmed on location in Romania from December 1st to December 8th, so he'll be off the house shows this week including MSG December 4th, which is already sold out. Smackdown on November 23rd in Rochester, New York drew a sellout 8,884 paying $225,251. Other weekend shows saw November 26th in San Jose draw 15,138 paying $372,894, 1,300 shy of a sellout. November 27th at the Cow Palace in San Francisco drew 12,034 paying $287,011 for a 2 p.m. show, 800 shy of a sellout. November 27th in Sacramento, California drew a sellout 16,231 paying $381,201 and November 28th in Bakersfield, California drew 6,395 paying $185,593. San Jose was a very good house show and really better than the majority of WWF pay-per-view shows. Just about everyone worked hard and the crowd was into most of the matches. It's very impressive to drew very close to sellout crowds for house shows with an evening show followed by an afternoon show in buildings that are about 45 miles apart and are in the same television market. They announced Austin not being there and quickly said that Rock would take his place in the main event, and Rock being as popular as he is now, the booze ended pretty quickly. In San Jose, Godfather pinned Blackman in 4:31 with a schoolboy. Godfather's entrance got over. They both worked hard but didn't work well together. It was kept short enough and the Godfather now has enough signature mannerisms that the heat stayed strong. Bulldog pinned Brown in 5:11. Bulldog didn't come out with the European title, nor was there an acknowledgement about this being a title match or not. Bulldog wrestles like he's really hurting, as his face winces doing his trademark power moves. Brown tried but it was only passable. Ivory beat Jacqueline in 1:48 with the move formerly known as the Tomahawks, which I guess we should follow Joey Styles' lead and call the Moretti. Jacqueline hasn't had much TV time so literally nobody cared about her. Real bad. Christian and Edge won a 2-on-3 over Too Cool and Jericho in 10:59. This was a hell of a house show match. Too Cool live have a tremendous act and work great with these guys. Match was non-stop action with good to great heat and everyone looking good. Christian is much better live in a match where he's given time than he comes across on television where he's limited to a few minutes. This match also exploded the myth that some like Triple H are propagating to keep Jericho down by saying he doesn't know how to work, as he was tremendous in his timing on everything here. After Chyna did her run-in attacking Jericho, Christian pinned Scotty 2 Hotty with the exact same move Ivory won with in the previous match. Guess what? He did it a lot better. Chyna looks even more ridiculous live than she does on TV, as even if you didn't know it, she's got the look of someone who's had extensive facial work done and her implants are so ridiculously disproportionate to her body and fake looking that it's beyond cartoonish and way beyond Sable at her silliest. Looking at photos of some of these women from 3 years ago today, you wouldn't even know some of them, Tori and Chyna in particular, are the same person. Live under the lights because of all their work they've had done, it's much more noticeable live than on television. Prince Albert pinned Test in 4:18 when Test missed a tackle and was pinned. For whatever reason, you just don't get the sense on television of how huge Albert really is, probably because WWF has so many big guys he just looks like a normal-sized guy, but in person he looks like a monster with a built-in fur coat. People weren't into this match as even in a short match you could sense both these guys needed a veteran to lead them, but they worked hard. Big Show pinned Bossman with a choke slam in 7:24 to keep the title. Show also choke slammed Albert, who tried to interfere, which probably explains why Albert was put over Test in the previous match. A lot better than you'd think, but still a below-average match. Their timing wasn't the best, but they worked a fast pace and Show was getting up and down and even threw a dropkick. I was really surprised how hard he worked live. Venus pinned Snow in 7:46 with a rolling reverse cradle. Really good match with a lot of good fast wrestling exchanges back and forth, very similar to their Raw TV match of a few weeks back, which was also unusually good. The fans at first weren't that into either guy except for their ring entrance and at first didn't understand the pure wrestling style. They were working almost old-style technical using modern spots, but the match was good enough that the heat built pretty good for the near falls, almost Japanese style. Acolytes won a four-way over Hollies, Hardys and Dudleys in 10:27. The first half was almost exclusively Hollies versus Hardys. The Hardys have the reps for working real hard at the house shows and Bob Holly looked real good with them and Crash was fine. Both teams were counted out, which was a finish the fans didn't like. It also left the Acolytes versus Dudleys, but they worked a fast pace and it was fine, ending when Farouk pinned Devon with a sidewalk slam. Kane pinned Viscera in 3:50 with a choke slam. He also choke slammed Midian at ringside. The wrestling was terrible due to Viscera, but they did enough stuff with Tori at ringside and at least kept it short. Maine saw Rock pin Triple H in 10:25. The reaction to Rock is a lot closer to Hogan at his peak than Austin's reaction ever was. I think the difference is that Rock, like Hogan, had a certain larger-than-life celebrity charisma to everything they did, whereas Austin's appeal was more a traditional wrestling appeal. Austin worked hard and got great heat, whereas Rock does his mannerisms and gets a great reaction. They worked a fast-paced hard match as well with some huge pops for a couple of near falls before Rock put him away with the people's elbow, and did his post-match interview and an encore song, which seemed to be the modern equivalent to Hogan's post-match posing routine, and just about nobody left the building until he was done. Now more than ever, the WWF is really fortunate to have someone like him to carry the company. On the Billboard Sports video charts, The Rock's video remains number 1, followed by the latest Austin release and Best of Raw Volume 1. Major League Baseball's All-Century Team moved up to number 4, followed by 2 more Austin videos at number 5 and number 6. WWF has 8 of the top 10 and 14 of the top 20. No WCW videos are in the top 20, but Wrestling with Shadows remains in the listings for the 21st straight week at number 16. According to WWF Senior Vice President Jim Byrne, Walmart is the only chain that has pulled the Al Snow dolls from its shelves, and that reports that have been circulating here and elsewhere regarding Target, Toys R Us and Kmart also pulling the dolls are incorrect. In an Atlanta Journal-Constitution story on November 30th, it still listed all 4 chains as having pulled the figure. Cron TV in San Francisco, in doing a story on November 30th, went to Toys R Us specifically requesting the Snow doll and was told that it had been pulled from the shelves. Foley on the TSN show did say that he thought the 12 chair shots at the Royal Rumble match with Rock was too much. Rock will be doing a Get Milk ad campaign. Inside Edition on November 30th did a feature on the Stephanie wedding as if the entire thing was a shoot. That's a great thing to do for credibility of your news. WWF is planning on opening 2 more themed restaurants, one in Miami and the other in Las Vegas. Whether it's the clash of titans in the ring or the drama that unfolds outside it, we're here to break it down, match by match, feud by feud. Remember, in the world of wrestling, every day is a battle, and every victory is a story waiting to be told. Until next time, keep the passion alive, and never stop wrestling with the possibilities. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine,